history often presents itself as a parade of plans. We imagine councils of war and cabinets of government, professors with maps and monarchs with signatures, all moving in a straight and competent line toward the future. But what if the real engine of the past was not mastery at all, but human error? What if a misread chart, a missed turn, a misjudged clause, a mislaid petri dish, or a misaligned clock swung the door to an age? What if an ambitious sailor trusted the wrong numbers and made an ocean seem smaller than it is? If his math had been sound, would any crown have risked the Western gamble at all? Can 1 hour on a clock doom an invasion before the first wave reaches shore? If a safety test meets darkness, secrecy, and hurry, how far can a siren carry on a windless night? If a field marshal stays home for a birthday and a forecast, how much room does that leave for strangers to land on a grey coast? Do ages turn on genius, or on the small mistakes that genius overlooked? Look closely at the numbers, the clauses, the streets, the clocks, the dishes, the doors. The story of how we got here may be written in the margins. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. If you're enjoying these stories, please take a moment to comment and subscribe. It's the simplest way to support what we're creating here, and it means a lot. Thank you for being here. Now, let us begin. In the late 15th century, the Atlantic still felt like an argument more than a map. Sailors knew islands that rose from the seas like rumors. Cartographers drew the edges of continents with a scholar's caution, then colored the empty spaces with guesses. Venice carried pepper and cloves through a gauntlet of middlemen. Portugal tunneled southward around Africa with caravels and patience. Spain had just closed a centuries-long war at Granada and looked up from the last banner on the Alhambra to ask what came next. The air of Europe smelled of incense, damp vellum, and the profit of distance. Christopher Columbus stepped into that air with a certainty that had more courage than arithmetic. He was a Genoese mariner by trade, a dreamer by temperament, and a stubborn negotiator by necessity. His early years are patchy on the page. He sailed the Mediterranean as a young man, learned currents and winds, and survived a shipwreck off Portugal. He read what he could find. The pages that mattered most to him were a curious mixture. He studied Ptolemy and medieval cosmographers. He studied the accounts of Marco Polo, who filled European minds with spices, silks, and a golden island called Cipangu. He studied a learned Arab writer, known to Latin scholars as Alfraganus, whose numbers were excellent, and he misunderstood them with conviction. Here is the heart of his mistake. The size of the earth had been measured in antiquity with admirable accuracy by Eratosthenes, who estimated a circumference remarkably close to the modern figure. Later, thinkers offered other values, and the medieval world inherited a cabinet of numbers without labels. Alfraganus gave the length of a degree of the earth in Arabic miles that were longer than the Italian or Roman miles Columbus knew. If the Arabic mile was nearly 2 kilometers, the Roman mile was shorter. Columbus took a sound calculation and forced it into a smaller unit, which shrank the earth like a garment run through the wash. Then he compounded the error by enlarging Asia on his map. He believed that Asia ran farther east than it does, that the island of Cipangu lay not far off the coast, and that a westward voyage from the Canary Islands would reach it in a matter of a few thousand miles. The real span of blue from the Canary Islands to East Asia could swallow fleets. His imagined span could be covered by 3 ships and a winter's luck. There was method in the madness. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453 had made the old land routes to Asia unreliable and expensive. Portuguese navigators had rounded more and more of Africa and were close to finding a sea road to India. Spain, newly unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, wanted a share of the eastern trade that did not depend on rivals or on a chain of caravan tolls. Columbus walked into royal courts with a sales pitch that answered a royal hunger. He was turned down in Portugal after a council of experts judged the voyage too long and the numbers too poor. He was turned down more than once in Spain as well. When he finally won support, it came at a moment of national exultation. The surrender of Granada had freed the crown for new ambitions, and a maritime experiment suddenly looked like destiny. The three ships were small in modern eyes. The Santa Maria was a broad-beamed carrack, built for cargo more than for speed. The Niña and the Pinta were nimble caravels with lateen sails that could claw their way into contrary winds. They were crowded with men, water casks, salted meat, biscuits, livestock, and a few astrolabes and compasses. They were also crowded with expectations. Men were promised shares in whatever was found, and the admiral himself was promised titles and a hereditary office if he could bring back a passage to the Indies. They sailed from Palos in early August 1492 and fell down to the Canaries to refit and wait for steady winds. From there, they stepped into water that no European captain had crossed in an open voyage to a destination. The Atlantic had moods. Some days the swells rolled like the breathing of a large animal. Some days the sea lay flat and bright, and the air smelled of tar and baked rope. Weed from the Sargasso clutched at the hulls and made men think of shoals and entanglement. For nights on end, the compass behaved oddly, and if Columbus noticed the variation, he did not share the fact widely. The logs that he kept may have been edited for crew morale. The figures he gave them for the distance run were sometimes smaller than the calculations he reserved for himself. The ocean did not argue. It only tried their patience. As the calendar turned to September, the crew began to measure the voyage in doubt more than in leagues. Birds flew westward and suggested land. A stork floating on the sea suggested a river mouth somewhere ahead. The wind held. The men talked of turning back. Their admiral invoked the reward of Spain, promised that it was farther to return than to continue, and pressed on past the 30th day and into the 40th. Hope is a real navigational force when the charts do not show the place you are trying to reach. Columbus was steering toward an idea that could not resist the facts. He believed he was approaching the outlying islands of Asia. He expected to find the riches described by Marco Polo, or at least signs pointing to them. On the night of the 11th of October, there were lights on the horizon, faint and intermittent, as if fire was moving along a shore. A few hours later, a lookout cried that he saw land. The ships came upon a low island with surf shouldering white on a beach. People stood on the sand watching these floating houses, and the trees beyond them were a vivid green after the weeks of endless water. In the morning, Columbus went ashore carrying the banner of Castile and a letter for the Great Khan that would never be delivered. He named the island San Salvador and believed it an outwork of the Indies. The people he met he called Indians because his math and his expectations told him that he must be somewhere near Asia. The people called themselves by names specific to their islands and spoke languages he could not understand. They brought parrot feathers, cotton, and small ornaments of gold. He took these as confirmation, not as contradiction. He read the landscape as a book that he already knew and lectured the margins with confidence. The islands he moved among after San Salvador were beautiful and densely wooded, ringed by water so clear that sand and fish could be seen at depth. He found Cuba and thought it was part of the Asian mainland. He found Hispaniola and thought it was near Cipangu. Nature tried to argue with him in the form of currents and coastlines, but his numbers held firm in his mind. When the Santa Maria ran aground on a reef on Christmas Day, men labored through the night to save the cargo and cannon. The ship itself was lost to the sea. From the timbers, a small settlement called La Navidad was made on the north coast of Hispaniola to hold a garrison until the admiral could return with more ships. He sailed back to Spain with remnants of the first cargo and with men and stories calculated to secure a second expedition. It is tempting to tell this as a tale of happy accident, a lucky blunder that opened a new world. The luck is real enough. Had the earth been as small as he declared, he and his men would have starved under a sky as blue as porcelain. There would have been no place to replenish water or food or hope. The numbers that he carried into the interview room were wrong enough to be dangerous, and they were wrong in a way that invited funding rather than caution. He had taken a value for the length of a degree that was expressed in the wrong kind of mile. He had taken a picture of Asia that extended farther east than it does. He had used a precedent from a scholar that he admired and then forced it to match a voyage he wanted to make, which is one of the oldest mistakes in human reasoning. What followed was not a simple story of discovery. It was the opening of a long and painful encounter in which power spoke the language of religion and trade and used both to claim land and labor. Columbus returned on a much larger second voyage, with ships big enough to carry cattle and seeds, and men who had not signed on as explorers. Sugar cane took root in Caribbean soil. A governor's office took shape. Disease came on the wind and on skin, and swept through communities that had no defenses against it. The admiral's own governorship descended into confusion and brutality. Complaints reached Spain with enough weight that he was eventually arrested and brought back in chains. Even after his name became famous, his reputation traveled with a long argument attached to it. The numbers did not improve with time in his own mind. He clung to the belief that he had reached the fringes of Asia and never fully surrendered it. Other navigators did the steady work of measuring coasts and currents and showed, in patient detail, that this was not the Indian Ocean at all. It was a pair of continents and an entirely separate world of rivers and mountain chains and civilizations that were already old when his sails first showed on the horizon. The miscalculation had opened the path. The correction filled the map. There is a second piece to the arithmetic that matters, and it is not just the circumference of the earth. It is the calculus of risk and reward as seen from a palace. Why did the Portuguese say no while Spain said yes? The most immediate answer is that Portugal had a rival project already in the water. Their navigators were rounding Africa step by step. Their councils had weighed the same numbers and judged the western crossing to be longer and less certain. Spain had no such fleet working down Africa. Spain had just secured a military victory that united the crown and stirred the appetite for glory. The spice trade offered cash returns and prestige in a Europe that had a thin tax base and a taste for silk and black pepper. A flawed equation that promises a short route can look irresistible when the alternative is to wait on another nation's experiment. Within the cabins of the Nina and the Pinta, the math looked different again. Sailors counted sleep in watches and bread by loaves that turned hard in a damp heat. Scorbutic gums and the ache of back and salt sores yield to nothing but landfall. Stories of sea monsters and endless waters still had the power to shape dreams. It took nerve to follow a leader who assured them that the globe was small enough for a westward march into the unknown, and it took nerve to consider turning back and admitting that it was not. The tension between those two forms of courage is one of the oldest on any frontier. The irony that historians enjoy is that Columbus used an astronomer who was right to prove a conclusion that was wrong. Alfraganus had taken the measure of the planet with the care of a scholar. The Arabic mile that he used was long, which made his figures elegant. Columbus translated that mile into the shorter mile that his world understood. The result lopped a quarter from the world. In a kind of poetic wrongness, it was just enough to persuade a council, and just enough to make a voyage of weeks seem plausible. The real world, broad as it is, supplied islands along the route like stepping stones. If the ocean between Africa and Asia had been empty, the story would have ended in grief far from shore. There is another irony. It was not European mathematics that saved Crew and Dream, at least not at first. It was the geography of the Caribbean and the presence of people on its islands. Canoes and cultivated fields were proof that the Atlantic did not ring the world like a moat. What Europeans called the discovery of a new world was, in truth, a meeting with an old one. The crossroads that opened after that meeting were made from many materials. Pride was there, greed was there, religious certainty was there. Curiosity was there too, but not always in command. The arithmetic of conquest and tribute soon overshadowed the arithmetic of latitude and longitude. For all of that, the sailor from Genoa did move the horizon for people who had never thought to sail into that part of the sea. Charts grew. Pilots learned to cross the Atlantic with confidence and to ride the trade winds out and the westerlies home. The so-called Columbian Exchange moved plants, animals, and microbes across the ocean in both directions and changed diets and ecosystems on two sides of the water. Tomatoes and chilies went east. Horses and wheat went west. Diseases followed both routes and took a grim toll. Population graphs bent and then recovered, and then bent again as silver flowed and sugar plantations spread. There are centuries of consequence folded into that first miscalculation. Biographers have tried to find the inner Columbus in the fragments of letters and legal disputes that survive him. He appears in those pages as intensely pious, proud to the point of delusion at times, and ready to interpret every favorable wind as a divine sign. He saw himself as an agent in a larger story that had to do with Jerusalem and prophecy. That mindset did not help his numbers, and it did help him ignore counter-arguments. He was a kind of self-appointed witness to a future he had already described to himself. That is not a temperament friendly to correction. The sea kept its own opinions. Pilots from other nations followed. Vespucci mapped coasts with words that convinced readers they were looking at something separate. Balboa found the Pacific from a height of land in Darien. Magellan would die on one shore of that ocean, and his crew would complete a voyage around the Earth that finally demonstrated the scale of what Columbus had guessed at and mismeasured. There is an instructive modesty in that arc. It took generations to fix what a single brilliant and mistaken mind had pushed into motion in a single season. The Spanish court that elevated the Genoese admiral eventually dealt with the complications of his authority. His promises of gold did not keep pace with reality. His governance on Hispaniola failed in ways that were ugly and public. He was sent home in chains and then released. He sailed again and tried new routes, still drawing Asia toward him with his words as surely as the needle draws north. He died without understanding the cartographic revolution he had helped cause. In that sense, the mathematics of the world he lived in never caught up to the world he helped reveal. There is an almost theatrical neatness to the moment when theory met water. A set of figures written on parchment convinced a queen and a king to write letters of commission. A fleet left a small port. The world that the mariners expected did not exist. The world that did exist changed everything they and their patrons thought they knew. Mistaken arithmetic opened the door, and then facts walked in and took up residence. The lesson a modern reader might take is not about the square root of distance, but about the way certainty can be a tide with a mind of its own. The admiral did not lack courage. He lacked humility before difficult numbers and before the complexity of the thing he was trying to measure. When he handed his estimates to doubting councils, and then to a trusting crown, he made a private error a public policy. That is when mistakes change history. Not when they happen on a bench on a quiet afternoon, but when they ride out with flags. And yet the human story is never only about mistakes. Navigation improves. Maps accumulate detail until there is almost nowhere left to say, "Here be dragons." Voyages begin as fables and end as schedules. The Atlantic that sobered his crew now holds cargo ships that cross like clockwork. The romance leaches out of water when a satellite can tell a captain where he is to the length of a shoe. There is a tenderness in remembering that before all of that progress, a man with a belief and a bundle of wrong figures carried a fleet into an emptiness that did not truly exist. The emptiness was only in his math. On a summer day in 1919, under chandeliers that once caught the glint of Louis Kings, the victors of the Great War gathered in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Outside, Europe still smelled of mud and smoke. Rail lines sprawled across a continent of craters. Fields were pitted and towns were patched. The influenza that followed the guns had turned the air into a quiet grief. Inside the Gilt Hall, pens were filled, chairs were set, and an old palace waited for new signatures. The ceremony fell on a date chosen with more meaning than mercy. It was the 28th of June, 5 years to the day since 2 gunshots on a Sarajevo street unstitched an old order. The peace that took shape in those rooms carried the ambition to end wars. It also carried, sewn into its seams, the anger and fear that make future wars thinkable. The men who shaped the document brought with them the demands of nations and the convictions of their own lives. Georges Clemenceau, the French Prime Minister known as the Tiger, wanted a Germany that could never again roll its armies across the Marne. He had watched the soil of France thrown up by shells in 2 wars in his lifetime, and he believed that security was a matter not of rhetoric, but of borders and burdens. David Lloyd George of Britain balanced strategy and politics with the eye of a practiced juggler. He knew his voters wanted Germany to pay. He also knew that Britain needed a Europe where trade could breathe. Woodrow Wilson arrived with the language of ideals. His 14 points had promised open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, and national self-determination. He dreamed of a League of Nations that would settle quarrels by rules rather than by rifles. Vittorio Orlando of Italy pressed for territorial pledges that had been made when Italy threw its weight to the Allied side. Around these 4 circled diplomats and experts, clerks and colonels, and the long shadow of men who had died in the trenches. Germany had no seat at the main table. The defeated were summoned later to receive terms, rather than to shape them. When German delegates finally saw the text, they called it a diktat, that ugly word for a dictated peace. In the popular retelling, one clause rose above all others. Article 231, the so-called War Guilt Clause, stated that Germany and her allies accepted responsibility for causing all the loss and damage of the war. The language was written by lawyers as a basis for reparations. In the streets, it read as a moral verdict. It burned in the German imagination, not because it was the only harsh phrase, but because it touched pride and memory. Austria had sent the brutal ultimatum to Serbia. Russia had mobilized. France had waited and vowed to stand by allies. Britain had entered when Belgium was invaded. The story was complicated, and it was made simple in one sentence that history class would never forget. The rest of the treaty put teeth in the verdict. Germany would surrender Alsace and Lorraine to France, lands that had changed flags before and now were sent back across the border with little ceremony and much relief in Paris. Eupen and Malmedy went to Belgium. Northern Schleswig, after a vote, went to Denmark. The Saar, rich in coal, went under League administration with its mines given to France for 15 years. In the east, the map that Prussia had drawn in earlier centuries was redrawn. West Prussia and Posen went to the new Poland, whose rebirth was one of the few clear fulfillments of Wilson's rhetoric. A corridor to the sea was cut for that state, and Danzig became a free city under the League. In the south, the Hulčin district went to Czechoslovakia. Upper Silesia, contested for its industry, was split after a plebiscite and violence that looked uncomfortably like a rehearsal of later tensions. Overseas empire was stripped from Berlin with an efficiency that made the powers look like auctioneers. German colonies in Africa and the Pacific did not become independent. They became mandates under the League, administered by Britain, France, Japan, South Africa, Australia, and New Zealand. In polite language, the treaty explained that the peoples of these places were not yet ready for self-government. In practical terms, it meant that the rich lands and strategic islands flew new flags and served new masters. The army of a nation that had marched to the gates of Paris was cut down to a force of 100,000 men. There would be no conscription. There would be no tanks and no heavy artillery. The general staff, that symbol of Prussian method and menace, was to be dissolved. The navy would keep a handful of old battleships and a small coast defense force. Submarines were forbidden. An air force that had filled the skies with aces was banned in its entirety. The industrial heart of Western Germany, the Rhineland, was demilitarized and placed under Allied occupation for a term of years. The logic was simple to the men who signed it. A Germany that could not arm, could not threaten. Then there was money. The war had been a furnace into which gold and men were shoveled in equal measure. The bill was enormous and hard to grasp. In 1921, an Allied commission fixed reparations at 132 billion gold marks. The number was a symbol as much as a sum. It signified that Germany would help pay for ruined towns and broken bridges and pensions for widows whose husbands had not walked back from the front. Economists argued over what Germany could afford. John Maynard Keynes, who had been part of the British delegation, walked out and wrote a book that would haunt the century. He called the settlement a Carthaginian peace and warned that strangling a great industrial nation would not bring stability. It would bring collapse and anger that would find expression in dangerous ways. Within Germany, the treaty landed like a weight thrown on a vessel already taking on water. The new Weimar government was forced to sign it or face a resumption of war. In the naval internment at Scapa Flow, as the terms became clear, German sailors scuttled their fleet rather than let it be divided among victors. The right called the signers November criminals, as if the armistice itself had been a betrayal rather than a reprieve from ruin. A poisonous story took root that the army had not been defeated in the field but stabbed in the back by politicians and protesters. That myth did not spring from Versailles, but Versailles fed it because humiliation is a diet that grows bitterness. In 1923, when Germany fell behind on deliveries of coal and timber, French and Belgian troops marched into the Ruhr to collect by force what the paper promised. The German government called for passive resistance. Factories slowed and stopped. Revenues dried up. The printing presses ran. The mark dissolved in a nightmare of zeros. Housewives hurried to buy bread before prices changed at noon. Savings that had been put by for children vanished between sunrise and supper. It is easy to overstate the degree to which reparations alone caused that collapse. The new republic was unsteady. The wounds of war were deep, but the cycle of penalties and protests created a spiral that pulled a society to the edge. When relief came, it came in the form of plans with American names. The Dawes Plan in 1924 and the Young Plan in 1929 restructured payments and tamed the exchange rates. By the time the world itself cracked in the Great Depression, reparations were effectively suspended. Yet the memory remained that the first years of the Republic had been years of humiliation at home and bullying from abroad. There is a counter-story, and a fair one, that says the treaty was not as uniquely cruel as popular legend makes it. Germany had imposed far harsher terms on Russia in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, when Russian armies buckled in 1918. If Germany had won in the West, there is little reason to think charity would have guided the pen. In France, the appetite for safety was not a pose. The soil itself seemed to speak for stern measures. Even in London, there were voices that feared a repeat of 1870, when a united Germany had suddenly appeared as the largest military land power in Europe. To these men, Versailles did not go far enough. They had wanted a permanently broken Germany. What they got, in time, was a resentful one. The measure of a peace is not only in the paper, but in the politics that follow it. After the signatures dried, Europe tried to build normal life. Germany elected governments, then overthrew them, then tried again. In the middle of that churn, a few statesmen recognized that Europe could not stay healthy on a diet of grievance. Gustav Stresemann in Berlin and Aristide Briand in Paris edged toward a different mood. The Locarno treaties of 1925 seemed to promise stability in the West. Germany entered the League of Nations in 1926. For a moment, it looked as if the continent might learn to live with the imperfect peace it had made. The moment did not last. The crash in New York in 1929 drained credit and confidence from every corner of Europe. The Weimar coalition staggered. Unemployment lines lengthened. Parties that lived on anger found audiences who were ready to listen. Here, the history teacher must be careful. Versailles did not invent Adolf Hitler. He was a product of many forces, including the turmoil of the early republic and the ruin of the world economy. But Versailles gave him a vocabulary and a grievance that he could rehearse to any crowd. The photographs of the signing at Versailles, the story of the guilt clause, the tales of the occupied Ruhr and the ravaged currency, all these worked as props in a performance that promised dignity and power. When he spoke of breaking chains, he could point to links that were brightly visible on maps and in law books. The irony, seen from the distance of a century, is that the men who had wanted to prevent another war may have built a bridge for one. Had the terms been less punitive and more practical? Had the reparations been tied to recovery rather than to humiliation? Had the borders been drawn with a clearer eye to the people who lived on either side of them, the story might have found gentler turns. The post-war settlement after the Second World War offers a suggestive comparison. The United States poured money into Western Europe through the Marshall Plan. It encouraged the remaking of Germany as a democratic partner rather than a crippled rival. Japan was occupied and disarmed, but also rebuilt and drawn into a trading system that rewarded stability. The architects of that later settlement had learned, at least in part, from the failures of Versailles. The defenders of the treaty would answer that such comparisons are unfair to the urgency of 1919. The maps were messier. Empires had fallen at once. Russia was in revolution. Central Europe was a tangle of languages and loyalties and claims. The negotiators were trying to arrange a chessboard while the table itself was shaking. Wilson believed that the League of Nations could be the frame that kept the picture from cracking. He returned to the United States to sell that idea and watched his own Senate refuse to buy it. The nation that had preached a new diplomacy refused to join the club that might have made any diplomacy stick. With the League weakened from birth, a settlement that leaned on a cane that would not bear weight. The signatures in the Hall of Mirrors brought an ending and a beginning. They ended a war that had turned a continent into a wound. They began a season in which language and law tried to rebuild life, while leaving powerful resentments in place. The men who walked from the palace steps into the sunlight could not see the whole distance their words would travel. Clemenceau died before the worst proof of his fears arrived. Lloyd George fell from office. Wilson suffered the stroke that left him a shadow of himself. In Germany, the men who had carried the humiliating terms home were scorned by many they hoped to protect. The peace that claimed to be the last of its kind planted seeds that grew under every weather. Even the setting had a lesson to teach. The Hall of Mirrors, where Prussians had declared a German empire in 1871, became the stage for the humiliation of that empire's heir. Ceremonies are history told with furniture. The choice of Versailles was a reminder and a warning and a provocation all at once. When German tanks rolled into France in 1940, the victors signed their armistice in the same railway carriage where Germany had accepted defeat in 1918. Europe sometimes learns slowly from its rituals. There is no single page in the treaty that can be pointed to as the fuse that was lit. There is instead a long mood of fear and vengeance and miscalculation. The fear belonged to a France that had suffered more than any victor should have to suffer. The vengeance belonged to those who believed that death and loss could be weighed out in currency and territory without cost to the spirit of a continent. The miscalculation belonged to all of them, in different measures, who thought that humiliation could be made to serve prudence. It never does, not for long. On the morning of June 28, 1914, Sarajevo woke to a nervous pageant. Flags hung along Appel Quay, white gloves dusted steps at the town hall, and policemen with borrowed sabers tried to look like a proper capital's guard. The city was a frontier place. Austria had annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina 6 years earlier, and the grand men in Vienna liked to imagine it as a jewel that had been mislaid and now set again in the imperial crown. For the people of Sarajevo, the day carried greater freight. It was Vidovdan, the feast of Saint Vitus, the anniversary of the medieval Battle of Kosovo, a sacred date in the Serbian imagination when princes and martyrs are remembered and the idea of a people's destiny can turn from liturgy into politics. Into that calendar and that street rolled an open car carrying an heir to an empire and his wife. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was not loved in Vienna, but he commanded respect, and he inspired fear in courtiers who guessed at a coming reign. He had a temper that could scorch. He had a mind full of schemes for reorganizing the empire into something more federal and less rigid, which frightened many officials who preferred the old arrangements. At his side sat Duchess Sophie Chotek, whom he had married for love over dynastic objections. Because the marriage was unequal by court standards, she was often required to step behind her husband at ceremonies and to accept slights with grace. Sarajevo, oddly, had promised a respite from that etiquette. As the wife of a future emperor on a provincial visit, she would share a seat beside him in the first carriage. The couple had marked the date as an anniversary trip of sorts. It would be their rare chance to appear together in public as equals. The route was published in advance. That was the first error. The car would move along the river on a palki to the town hall, then continue to inspect troops and pay calls. The second error was the choice of an open touring car. It made for better photographs and better theatre. It also made everything else easier for anyone who might want to ruin the day. In the shadows of cafes and along the railings stood a ring of boys. They called themselves Young Bosnia, and they were bound by a cause that ran through the secret society in Belgrade known as Unification or Death, which foreigners called the Black Hand. In the months before the visit, a Serbian officer named Dragutin Dimitrijevic, known as Apis, had set the machinery of conspiracy into motion. Pistols were smuggled across the border. Cyanide capsules were distributed with the false promise that they would end a life quickly and without pain. The boys were told to be brave and to be many, so that fate would have more than one chance to act. One of those boys, Gavrilo Princip, had been born in a village of stones and thin fields. He was small, wiry, and intense. He read poetry and political pamphlets. He carried an idea of national unification the way another boy might carry a talisman. Along with him were Nedeljko Kabrinovic and Trifko Grabes and others who would stand at set points on the day. They had practiced with their pistols. They had rehearsed in their minds the moment of approach. They had also eaten little and slept less, and had only a foggy confidence in the cyanide that was supposed to save them from the hangman. The Archduke's car glided down a Quay with a local governor, Oskar Potiorek, riding elsewhere in the motorcade, and with Leopold Leuker at the wheel. At a bridge, Kabrinovic stepped forward and threw a bomb. Fate and mechanics interceded. The device bounced off the folded hood of the royal car, fell under the following automobile, and exploded there, wounding officers and bystanders but missing the target. Kabrinovic swallowed his poison and jumped into the Miljacka River. The poison was old and made him vomit. The river was shallow after a dry spell. Police dragged him out. The royal car accelerated to the town hall while sirens and screams chased it. Inside the town hall, a flustered mayor began to deliver his prepared greeting. Franz Ferdinand cut him off with words that hung in the air. "I came here as your guest, and I am greeted with bombs." The courtiers tried to steady the scene with speeches and ink and handkerchiefs. The Archduke, shaken but determined, insisted on visiting the wounded at the hospital. This decision, humane and stubborn, created the third error of the day. A new route was chosen to avoid the narrow streets. The plan was to stay on the river road instead of turning into the city. But in the confusion, the driver took the old turn. Communication in the cars was poor. Potiorek shouted that they were going the wrong way. Loika braked. The engine stalled. The car stood still at the corner of Franz Joseph Street and Appel Quay, in front of Schiller's Delicatessen. At that very spot, because he had failed earlier and abandoned his assigned position, stood Gavrilo Princip. He had wandered into the shop for a sandwich and a clearer head. He stepped back out and found the world stopping for him. The royal couple sat less than a few paces away in a motionless car. Princip moved toward the running board. He raised an FN Model 1910 pistol, a compact Belgian handgun chambered for a 380 cartridge, and fired 2 shots. One bullet struck the Archduke in the neck, slicing through the jugular. The other hit Sophie in the abdomen. She slumped across her husband. He urged her to live, calling her by the pet name Sophel. "It is nothing," he said. "It is nothing. Stay alive for the children." The blood soaked his tunic. Within minutes, both were dying on the way to the governor's residence. The wrong turn and the stalled engine had done as much as any ideology to deliver the end. Almost every detail of that morning reads as a lesson in how a state can fail at the simplest tasks of security. Local authorities had refused the heavy hand of soldiers because they did not wish to appear as occupiers in a prickly city. Warnings had reached desks and had been filed rather than followed. The passage of the motorcade had been announced in newspapers, as if one were inviting admirers rather than adversaries. The decision to continue with public events after the first bomb was made by a proud man with a sense of duty and a temper. The fourth mistake, which fate disguised as mercy, was the Archduke's insistence on visiting the hospital. The pistol and the bullets have their own small history. The FN 1910 was a modern semi-automatic designed by John Browning and manufactured at Herstal. It fit easily in a coat pocket and could be fired quickly and without the fussy motions of a revolver hammer. The cyanide that failed was as much a relic as a weapon. Princip and Kabrinovich carried it in small glass vials, but the compound had degraded. Its failure to kill them swiftly ensured trials and testimonies that turned private fantasies into public drama. The city of Sarajevo endured a frenzy after the shots. Crowds attacked Serbian-owned shops. Police and gendarmes rounded up suspects. Princip was 19 years old and could not be executed under the law of Austria. He received a 20-year sentence and was sent to Theresienstadt, where he wasted with tuberculosis and died in the spring of 1918, his body thin and his arm amputated to treat infection. Kabrinovich, sickly even before the day, died in the same prison in 1916. A handful of the conspirators who had assisted them were tried in Belgrade later, and their fates became part of a bleak argument between neighbors who would quarrel again within a lifetime. The better-known argument began in chancelleries the week after the funeral. The assassination unlocked passions that had been locked behind polite speeches. Austria wanted to punish Serbia for tolerating a network of conspirators and for stirring agitation among Slavic subjects inside the empire. German ministers, appealed to by Vienna, gave what historians call the blank check on July 5th. They assured Austria of German support, even if the crisis called down the wrath of Russia. Serbia, aware of its peril, turned to Russia, which could not afford to abandon a Slavic client in a contest that touched prestige and influence in the Balkans. France, bound to Russia, watched anxiously and weighed mobilization plans. Britain preferred to keep its options open and hoped that the other three might find a way to bark without biting. The ultimatum that Austria delivered to Serbia on July 23rd was a document meant to be refused. It demanded the suppression of nationalist publications, the dismissal of certain officers, and the participation of Austrian officials in investigations on Serbian soil. Serbia accepted most of it and quibbled at the clauses that cut its sovereignty to the bone. Austria declared war on July 28th. Within days, Russia mobilized to signal that it would not watch a client be crushed. Germany mobilized to counter Russia. Germany then declared war on Russia on August 1st and on France 2 days later, and then demanded passage through Belgium to reach the French frontier. Belgium refused, and German troops crossed the border anyway. Britain, guarantor of Belgian neutrality since the 19th century, declared war on Germany on August 4th. One can trace these events on a map as a flow of arrows. It is easy to forget that the first arrow was a stumble. Had the driver on Appel Quay been briefed about the new route, had a policeman at the corner waved his arm, had the engine not stalled, Princip's moment would have passed without a target. It is also true that the deeper causes of the war would have hunted for another pretext. The alliance systems that had developed since Bismarck were now brittle and less well managed. Secret war plans, especially the German plan that focused on a quick strike through Belgium to defeat France before turning east to Russia, locked military timetables to railway timetables. Once mobilizations began, calls for calm were drowned out by whistles at train stations and by the rhetoric of national honor. The wrong turn supplied the match for a pile of dry wood. The optics of the day mattered as much as the rifles. The Austrian insistence on an open car without a layer of troops lining the route was a choice made for appearances. The governor wanted to show calm. The court in Vienna wanted to show that annexation had produced a city at ease. Security was sacrificed to theater, and the theater became tragedy. Even the date spoke to a blind spot. To schedule a visit for Vidovdan in a city with a large Serbian community was to invite symbolism to sit in the front row. To then underline that symbolism with a parade of uniforms was to provoke the very men who had learned from schoolbook and song that June 28th belonged to a different drama. The longest story of the wrong turn lives in the strange alloy of chance and structure. Historians are right to remind us that chance alone cannot carry a continent to war. They are also right to savor the detail of a stall at the corner and a boy with a pistol who recognized a destiny when a chauffeur lifted his foot. Later, poets would imagine history as a locked room where windows and doors sometimes swing open to the strongest breeze. That day, the breeze smelled of motor oil and river water, and new ink and fear. For years after, the car itself was displayed in museums as if it were a relic of a saint. The uniform with its dark stain, the pistol with its serial numbers, the chair that held the Duchess, all became objects through which people tried to pinch themselves and believe that a life could be changed so quickly by a missed instruction and a single turn of the steering wheel. Oskar Potiorek, the governor whose pride had helped set the day's tone, was relieved of command after a military defeat later that year. Leopold Leuker survived the war, but never the story. He is remembered for the brake he pressed and the moment when an engine went quiet. One last thin thread completes the weave. After the first bomb at the town hall, Sophie had urged her husband to leave. "No more visits," she said. "Let us go home." The Archduke, stubborn and certain of duty, overruled her. "We must see our wounded," he said. The choice sounds noble, and perhaps it was. It was also fatal. A small decision at a tabletop, a small slip at a corner, a small pistol at a curb, and the slope of an age changed. The wind that moves across the steppe can carry a long memory. It remembers the paths of herds and the smoke of winter camps. It remembers the voices of riders and the clatter of hooves over frozen ground. In the first years of the 13th century, those winds carried the name of a man who had gathered quarrelsome tribes into a single bow. Temujin had taken the title Genghis Khan and turned loyalties that once died with a chieftain into a structure that outlived men. He bound clans by oath, divided his armies into units of 10 and 100 and 1,000, rewarded skill, punished betrayal, and yoked ambition to a larger order. He did not invent the horse archer or the steppe raid. He perfected the art of turning motion into power. The world east of the Oxus River learned his name first in rumor and then from the glare of campfires beyond the skyline. To the west of those fires lay the rich cities of Transoxiana and Khwarazm. The Shah, Ala al-Din Muhammad, sat on a throne that commanded caravan routes from the Caspian to the Hindu Kush. His empire was a quilt of proud towns and deep irrigated fields stitched together by tribute and fear more than by affection. Bukhara and Samarkand paid the bills. Otrar guarded the northern gate. The Oxus watered a world of canals and orchards. The court at Gurganj boasted that no city could match its wealth. In the bazaars were dyed silks and carved wood and plates of silver. Scholars debated in madrasas whose courtyards rang with voices until the shadows lengthened. Traders moved under the protection that Islamic law had tried to give to merchants and messengers, since the first caravans carried the Prophet's name, along with bolts of cloth and sacks of pepper. Genghis Khan wished to be part of that network. He had no fleet for the Indian Ocean. He had horses and the humility to learn from other civilizations when it served him. He sent a caravan in the year 1218 that carried furs, metals, and a promise. His letter treated the Shah as a brother in trade. It asked for safe passage and signaled that a new customer and a new partner stood at the gate of Central Asia. In the desert city of Otrar, the governor was Inalchuk, a man whose pride was as large as his suspicion. He saw not partners, but spies. The story that traveled then said there were 450 men in the caravan. Another version gave fewer. What is settled is that the governor seized the goods and arrested the men. After a pause that can be measured in human anxiety, he had them killed. Genghis Khan did not answer first with arrows. He sent 3 envoys to the Shah. One was a Muslim chosen to show respect. 2 were Mongols, who carried the authority of a ruler who had already learned how to turn insult into iron. They asked for reparations. They asked for the governor to be handed over. They asked for the acknowledgement of a wrong, so that trade could live again. The Shah's advisors counseled defiance. The Shah himself saw a chance to announce that he would not be spoken to by a nomad king who had lately come to power. He ordered the Muslim envoy beheaded. He had the beards of the 2 Mongols shaved and sent them back with nothing but contempt as escort. Among steppe peoples, the person of an envoy had a sanctity that grew from custom and from common sense. Men who wished to live by treaties must allow messengers to pass without harm. The insult did more than bruise pride. It broke a rule that kept distant worlds from tearing at each other every time tempers rose. When the envoys returned, they came bearing the most dangerous news of all. They carried back the feeling that justice could not be found with speech. Genghis Khan swore to punish the Shah. and to make examples of those who had treated his ambassadors as if they were thieves. The campaign that followed in the years 1219 to 1221 did not feel like a raid. It felt like a season in which geography itself turned against the cities. The Khan knew that a single thrust at a strong target invites a long siege, and a long siege wastes horses and time. He divided his forces. He sent Jebe and Subutai, his most gifted scouts and generals, on a wide arc through the Kizil Kum. He sent his sons Jochi and Chagatai and Ogadeh to different gates. He kept a central mass under his own eye and moved like water into the spaces that opened. These men used flags and drums to signal. They used smoke to confuse. They used a deliberate, feigned flight to turn defenders into a routed mass when a gate was suddenly left unguarded. They rode with 3 or 4 remounts and could change horses at a gallop to keep the pace of an army faster than the news of its approach. Otrar was the first object. Inalchuk had filled his granaries and trusted thick walls and his own stubbornness. The siege lasted into months. Engineers who had learned their art in China came forward with mangonels and traction trebuchets. Sappers worked at the base of walls with picks while arrows clattered above them. A betrayal within the garrison opened a postern door. Mongol troops poured through the breach and turned the streets into a killing zone. The governor was taken alive. The story that ran later said that molten silver was poured into his eyes and ears. Chronicles enjoy a poetic justice, and it is possible that this tale was made to fit a need for symmetry. What the sources agree on is that he died as an example and that Otrar ceased to be a gate for the empire and became a ruin that smelled of ash. Bukhara heard the hoofbeats next. The city was famous for its scholars and its merchants. Its citadel, the Ark, dominated low houses and the maze of souks. The Mongol vanguard appeared where defenders thought the desert had closed a door. The horsemanship that brought them there was a kind of map. Genghis Khan approached and sent a message that offered terms. Open the gates and your lives will be spared. Resist and pay the price. The outer city fell with little fight. The citadel held out. The Khan entered the Friday mosque and changed it to a stable for a night, a symbol intended not for theology, but for terror. He is remembered as speaking to the gathered people and telling them that he was the punishment for their sins. That sentence may be a memory polished by a later writer, but the policy it implies is true to his practice. Those who surrendered could be spared. Artisans were separated from the mass and sent eastward, where their skills could enrich the Khanate. Those who resisted were killed or enslaved. The Ark eventually fell, and with it fell the illusion that the towns could survive by brave words alone. Samarkand was larger and richer than Bukhara. It had a garrison that included soldiers from many parts of the empire, men whose loyalty was to pay and to survival rather than to the city. The Mongols arrived with siege machines and with prisoners from earlier victories pressed into labor to move them. A few days of resistance and then the walls were entered. The pattern repeated. There was slaughter where a stand was made. There was sparing where a timely surrender allowed the conquerors to count their gains in craftspeople and in coin rather than in corpses. The Shah had dispatched troops and then recalled them. He hesitated at moments when a decision would have mattered. He began to move himself from city to city with the treasure that could be carried and the doubt that could not. The richest prize in the north was Gurganj, also known as Urganj, a city whose wealth had bought a pride of its own. The terrain there was a problem for riders. The Amu Darya divided and looped through marsh and irrigation. Houses stood amid canals. Streets were tight, and the turning of horsemen into alleys dulled their advantage. The princes quarreled. Jochi urged a siege that would starve the city into surrender. Chagatai pressed for assault and discipline. Ogedei was appointed to hold the balance. When the city fell at last, the killing was heavy. No single number is trustworthy. Chroniclers were given to large estimates to match the scale of shock. It is enough to say that a population was reduced in a way that took generations to replace, and that the irrigation works that made the region bloom were broken in places where no one remained to mend them. Shah Muhammad fled west into the deserts beyond the Oxus and across to the Caspian. He left behind him a son with fire in his name. Jalal al-Din gathered as many followers as would stay and fought a series of actions while his father died on an island of the Caspian Sea. A man who had once ruled from Tabriz to Tashkent and now had only a cloak for a pillow. Jalal al-Din showed courage and skill. At Parwan, he beat a Mongol force and gave his people a taste of victory. Genghis Khan took notice and gathered a larger host for the young warrior. The meeting came at the great river of the Punjab. On the banks of the Indus in 1221, the two forces clashed in a battle that left the river choking with men and horses. Jalal al-Din fought his way to the water, gathered his few remaining, and plunged in. He reached the far shore alive. Genghis Khan watched from a ridge, and is said to have admired the courage of the escape. He sent riders but did not take the young prince. Jalal al-Din would continue to harry the edge of Mongol-held lands for years, a thorn that drew blood and then vanished again into the scrub. While the center of the empire fell apart, Jebe and Subutai were given permission to roam. That word sounds gentle. Their march was a lesson in how to read a continent. They moved through the Caucasus, played enemies off each other with offers of peace that cost nothing and yielded much, and defeated a coalition of Alans and Kipchaks. They crossed passes that packs of mules shuddered at. They touched the edge of Georgia and left it bleeding. They reached the great open lands of the Rus and lured an army into a trap by the river Kalka. There, in 1223, the princes of Kiev and their allies were broken. The commanders were smothered under boards at a banquet, a punishment meant to show contempt for noble persons while preserving a show of delicacy before the gods. Then, like a tide that has no intention of drowning ashore just yet, the Mongol armies withdrew to the east to report and to prepare for the next cycle. Much is made of Mongol cruelty, and there is much to make. There is also a cold clarity in their method. They offered terms and kept promises to those who accepted. They punished resistance in ways that took the will to resist out of neighboring cities that watched the smoke of their rivals' roofs. They learned quickly. In a region of canals, they flooded walls and turned streets into rivers. In a region of high mud brick, they brought siege engines and trained prisoners to move them. They spread fear with stories about what had been done elsewhere, exactly as a modern power uses the reach of a telegraph or a printed broadsheet to shape a rumor into a weapon. They kept scribes at hand to count and to record, because wealth must be measured before it can be taxed. They treasured artisans because every empire rides on grain and iron and the beautiful things that convince a conquered people that life can be lived under new masters. The moral heart of the story remains at the city gate where a caravan was destroyed and at a court where 3 men were shamed and killed. Had Inal-Chuk honored the rules of passage, had the Shah rebuked a governor who wished to be a king, had the envoys been fed and sent on, the steppe might have found profit more inviting than revenge. It is true that Genghis Khan did not need much excuse to push his frontier west. It is also true that he took pains to seek a pretext that would make his war seem like a court case in which he was the one injured party. The speech he had given his own nobles when he set out to break the Jin in the east had cast that campaign as a matter of justice. Now, in the west, he could summon his people to a duty made sacred by the violation of hospitality and of law. When the dust settled and years turned, the places that had been charred began to live again in altered form. The Mongol Empire stitched together a realm in which a merchant could travel from the north of China to the Black Sea, with a passport issued by a Khan and a chain of relay stations that offered fresh mounts and guards. The Yam system allowed orders to run faster than Aruma. Markets developed in the wake of destruction. Samarkand and Bukhara recovered in new robes, while artisans taken from them worked silk and metal in cities to the east. Knowledge moved too. Engineers and astronomers and doctors found that a conqueror who valued their crafts could be more reliable than a prince who valued only the titles of his fathers. Yet the ledger has another page. The Khwarezmian catastrophe was a lesson in what happens when leaders confuse honor with insult and make contempt a policy. The simple truth that an envoy must be safe is not a small courtesy. It is the hinge on which empires admit that enemies must sometimes talk. The insult to Genghis Khan's ambassadors did not merely precede a war. It defined it. Every city that fell thereafter felt the weight of a story about a governor who could not leave a caravan alone and a shah who believed that shaving a beard and cutting a head would make a distant power shrink back into the grass. The wind on the steppe carries more than memory, it carries warning. In this story, it carries the murmur of unwashed beards, the hiss of a seal broken on a letter written in 2 languages, the creak of a siege machine pulled across sand, and the splash of a young prince and his horse leaping into a river to keep a cause alive. A single breach of an old rule turned trade into legend and a grievance into a season of fire. The road into the Zapata swamp looks like a line drawn by a nervous hand. Mangroves stoop over brackish water. The sand is powdery and white, where it has not been stained by fuel. Beyond the scrub, the Bay of Pigs opens to the Caribbean, a shallow crescent cupped by coral and guarded by reefs that lie just beneath the surface like old bones. It was along this coast that a small army of exiles tried to reclaim a country in the spring of 1961, guided by a plan born in secret rooms and undone in part by a clock that did not agree with itself. The story began years earlier, not at the shoreline, but in Havana and in Washington. Fidel Castro's guerrillas had entered the Cuban capital in early January of 1959. The dictator Fulgencio Batista had fled, leaving behind a police force hated for its prisons and a society raw with the hope of a different future. In the months that followed, the new government purged old officers, confiscated estates and factories, and began to exchange public embraces with the Soviet Union. The United States watched sugar quotas rise and fall, and watched Soviet ships tie up along Cuban docks with wheat and machinery below decks. The distance from Key West to Cuba can be read on a dashboard compass. The idea that a Marxist government would sit at that distance felt intolerable to men who had fought the last war in Europe and were learning to think in the new logic of the Cold War. It was in the closing months of the Eisenhower administration that the Central Intelligence Agency was given a broad mandate to recruit Cuban exiles and train them to return with rifles and a flag. The agency had enjoyed recent success in Guatemala, where a small force and a radio script had helped topple a government. This success became a template and a temptation. In camps at Retalhullo in Guatemala, and later at Puerto Cabezas in Nicaragua, men who had left Cuba were drilled into a brigade with a number for a name. They became Brigade 2506, a unit that would carry its designation like a badge and a wound. The plan, called by the cheerful code name Operation Pluto, envisioned a landing on the southern coast where there were few witnesses and fewer garrisons. The exiles would seize a beachhead, hold an airstrip, declare a provisional government, and hope that crowds of Cubans would rise and join them. In Washington, the operation had to survive two kinds of scrutiny. It had to convince military planners that it could succeed, and it had to promise politicians that it would look like something other than an American invasion. From the start, there was a tension between effect and appearance. The original plan called for a landing near Trinidad at the base of the Escambray Mountains. There were sympathetic communities there, and cover for guerrilla war if the first days went badly. The new administration of John Kennedy was briefed in January. He was young, cautious about commitments in the first months of office, and acutely aware of how it would look to send the Marines to a Caribbean island that remembered earlier interventions. At the urging of advisors, he moved the strikes south and west to the Bay of Pigs, a more remote place with fewer roads and more water. The shift brought deniability in the short term and cost the rebels options in the long. Air power sat at the center of the plan. The Cuban Air Force was small but not trivial. It possessed British-made Sea Fury fighters, American-made B-26 bombers left from the Batista years, and a handful of T-33 jets, the quick and nimble trainers that could be armed to bite. The agency's blueprint called for a carefully timed sequence. On April 15th, 2 days before the landing, a first wave of 8 B-26 bombers flown by exile pilots would strike the Cuban airfields at San Antonio de los Baños, Ciudad Libertad, and Santiago de Cuba. The goal was to destroy aircraft on the ground and frighten pilots from the sky. A second strike at dawn on the day of the landing would finish the job. The brigade's ships would then approach a coast with little risk from the air. The first strikes lifted off from Nicaragua and hit their marks, but not hard enough. Some planes were destroyed at San Antonio and at Santiago. Others survived. One of the exile bombers, painted a drab Cuban green and given patches to imitate bullet holes, flew to Miami and landed. The pilot walked into a press conference with a story that he was a Cuban airman who had defected after refusing to bomb his own people. The story had been scripted. The staging had been sloppy. Reporters noticed that the nose of the plane did not match the model used in Cuba and that the gun ports were sealed. The ambassador of the United States to the United Nations, Adlai Stevenson, repeated the defection tale in front of the world, then learned that he had been given a tale, not a fact. Nothing curdles a diplomat's confidence like discovering that the prop on his stage will not hold his weight. In the scramble that followed, President Kennedy canceled the second daybreak strike. The fear of being caught in a lie was allowed to outrank the fear of being caught on a beach. In the night before the landings, men in the brigade sat on decks and checked their weapons. They were mostly young, many from Havana and Matanzas, some from the countryside. A few had held rank in the old army, most had not. They had been promised that the skies would be friendly. They had been told that their ships would anchor in quiet water behind protective reefs. They had not been told that coral is not a rumor. When the bows of their landing craft touched what looked like mud, they found the teeth of the reef chewing propellers and punching holes. The first hours of the landing at Playa Girón and Playa Larga were spent with ropes and curses as men pulled equipment over sharp coral under fire. On shore, the Cuban response was not the sleepy reaction the planners had hoped to find. Castro had been warned through a lattice of informants and readings of the sea. He had placed militia and regular troops on the move. Tanks rattled into the marshy roads. T-34 steel hulks, relics of a war fought on a different continent, now stood guard over palm and mangrove. Sea Fury fighters and T-33 jets took to the sky. Two supply ships of the exile convoy, the Houston and the Rio Escondido, tried to bring ammunition and fuel close to shore. The Cuban pilots attacked. The Houston burned and sank with vehicles and weapons on board. The Rio Escondido, carrying much of the brigade's fuel, ammunition, and radio equipment, exploded in a sheet of flame that curled back on the sea. Debris fell like tin rain. A plan built on tight logistics does not survive the loss of its fuel and its radios with ease. Through the 17th and 18th of April, the fighting on the roads to Playa Larga and Girón was fierce and personal. Exile companies dug in along berms and ditches and placed recoilless rifles to meet the armor. There are photographs of young men in American fatigues without insignia crouching behind low walls, of bazooka teams taking aim at the hull of a tank, of militiamen from the other side, with their faces grim under cloth caps. The exile pilots flew sorties from the airstrip at Puerto Cabezas and from fields that had been prepared for them, and they hit columns and bridges with courage and with too few planes. The brigade's men asked for more air cover again and again, not as a luxury, but as a hedge against the sky that hunted them. At sea, American warships watched the coast from a lawful distance. The aircraft carrier Essex and the carrier Independence waited beyond territorial waters. On their decks sat Navy fighters that had speed and guns and pilots who had practiced over the Atlantic. They had also been briefed that they were not to cross a line into Cuban airspace unless a very narrow set of circumstances came to pass. Deniability is a delicate garment. It cannot be trusted at the seam. The men on those decks heard the calls for help on radios that crackled and faded with the loss of the Rio Escondido. They could patrol the blue above the ships. They could not chase the jets that were strafing the beach. On the morning of April 19th, with the beachhead shrinking and the last crates of ammunition open and nearly empty, a final effort was made to give the exiles cover from the air. A group of B-26 bombers took off again from Nicaragua to strike the Cuban airfields and the columns that were bearing down on the beaches. To protect them, Navy fighters were to be on station near the shore to intercept any Cuban aircraft that rose to meet them. It was a simple sequence. It depended on time. Somewhere in the chain, in the conversion of one local hour to another, the clocks did not match. Nicaragua was 1 hour behind Cuba. The B-26 bombers flew by their watches and reached the coast before the fighters were in place. They arrived with courage and without escort. Cuban pilots met them in the sky. At least 2 of the bombers were shot down. 4 American airmen who had been flying as civilian volunteers died that morning. Their names are a solemn list that once was not spoken in public. Thomas Willard Ray, Leo Baker, Riley Schamberger, and Wade Gray. Their bodies and the wreckage of their planes became part of a debate that could not be held at the time. The hour that slipped between Nicaragua and Cuba was the sort of mistake that uses no gunpowder and kills with a silence. By the end of that day, the brigade's position had become a ring that tightened with each attack. Fresh water was scarce. Ammunition that had been counted in crates was now counted in handfuls. There are recorded messages sent from the beach that still ache when read. We are out of ammo. We cannot hold. Where is the air cover? The last planes swept over, dropping the last bombs they had. The last boats slid back out through the shaky channels that their pilots had memorized. Some of the exiles tried to break out of the perimeter and move into the swamp in small groups. Others fought until their weapons were empty and then waited with hands raised. The battle had lasted 3 days. The aftermath had the rhythm of a courtroom without a judge. In Havana, Castro walked among prisoners as cameras filmed. In Washington, sets of explanations were drafted and redrafted. The State Department emphasized that no American troops had landed. The president took responsibility for the failure and kept private, his anger at a system that had moved him from a skeptical first meeting to the edge of a war he had not wanted. Officers at the agency wrote memoranda that read like final exams in humility. Some argued that if the second strike had been flown at dawn on the 17th as planned, the outcome might have been different. Others admitted that the expectation of a general uprising in Cuba had been a fantasy that no intelligence reporting had truly supported. The exiles were taken to jails. In time, after negotiations that included the help of private citizens and the promise of food and medicine, more than 1,000 prisoners were exchanged and sent to Miami in December of 1962. There are many lessons in these events, braided together like the channels through the swamp. There is the lesson of deniability. A plan that must succeed and remain secret often does neither. There is the lesson of logistics. Reefs and fuel and radios will always have more to say than an elegant memo. There is the lesson of intelligence. Cubans who disliked their government did not become an army at the sound of a distant landing. There is the lesson of politics. A young president was forced to choose between the truth in a speech and the chances of men on a beach. And there is the lesson of time, which is the quietest and often most cruel teacher. The 1-hour difference between Nicaragua and Cuba seems like a detail that an office clerk could fix with a pen. In practice, it destroyed the most fragile thread of hope for the men who were flying low over mangroves, looking for familiar shapes on the water and listening for friendly voices in their headsets. The clocks in a war plan are not numbers on a page. They are the heartbeat of the plan. If they slip out of sync by a minute, nothing may happen. If they slip by 60 minutes, a flight arrives alone in the sky, and the ground beneath it keeps the ledger in bullet holes. The Bay of Pigs did more than cost lives. It changed the ways that presidents and spies spoke to each other. It taught a generation of officers to weigh the appetite for action against the arithmetic of means. It hardened a leader in Havana and led him to welcome Soviet missiles the next year, trusting that the same caution would restrain Washington again. It gave a lesson to the men of Brigade 2506 about loyalty to a lost home and the costs of relying on promises that must be explained in the well of a parliament rather than kept on a beach. Walk again along the water where the surf breaks on coral. Imagine the B-26 bombers as they approach, holding to a course that has been calculated back at the field while a watch ticks on a wrist. There is no smoke of friendly fighters sliding into place beside them. In a few minutes, there will be other aircraft in the sky, and the fabric of the plan will tear where it has always been thinnest. It tears where a simple oversight lives. It tears where a telephone call to check a time would have saved a life. History is often grand in the telling and small in the failing. The hour that was not there is proof. The air in a London laboratory at summer's end has a particular smell. It is a blend of damp plaster, coal dust from the city, and the faint sweet note that old agar gives off when it warms under lamps. Late August of 1928 had left that odour draped over the small bacteriology rooms at St Mary's Hospital in Paddington. Petri dishes were stacked like white saucers on a bench near a window that was seldom shut. On one bench stood flasks and pipettes and a jar of cotton plugs that looked like a pot of thin wool. On another bench stood a sheaf of notes written in a tidy hand about a family of bacteria that every hospital feared and every surgeon cursed. Alexander Fleming came back from a short holiday and did what good experimenters do. He looked at his plates. He had been growing Staphylococcus, a golden colony maker that turned wounds cloudy and turned bloodstreams deadly. The plates had been left out for a few days in a room that never truly kept its own counsel. He lifted one lid and found a small miracle. A pale bloom of mold sat on the agar near the edge, ragged at the rim and blue-green at the heart. Around the bloom, the staph colonies had vanished as though someone had drawn a watery circle with a brush. Beyond the circle, the golden specks were alive and well. Inside the circle, the lawn of bacteria was gone. A clean ring of no growth, a halo, a silence where there should have been noise. He turned the plate to the light and felt curiosity do what it always does when it is rewarded. It leaned in. Fleming had begun his scientific life in a war and on the wards. He had trained under Sir Almroth Wright, a man who could be as difficult as he was brilliant, and he had seen what happened when antiseptics like carbolic were poured into wounds with more zeal than knowledge. The acids killed bacteria, yes, but they also killed tissue. He had watched men die, not only from infection, but from cures that were poison with a spoon. He studied the survival of bacteria under conditions that doctors thought were sterilizing, and he learned to respect the stubbornness of a microbe. He once found that tears and saliva could cut into bacterial walls, and in 1922 he named the substance that did the cutting lysozyme. The discovery came when a drop from his own nose landed in a culture and cleared a patch by accident. Few men have written their names in history twice by sneezing at the right moment. That background gives weight to the way he reacted to the halo around the mold. He did not throw the plate away as a contamination. He did not scold a technician for a dirty bench and call for the sink. He scraped a little of the mold onto fresh media and asked it to grow. He took fluid from around the colony and dripped it into other dishes seeded with bacteria. He tested different species and watched which ones died and which ones sneered back. The juice from the mold hit gram-positive bugs hardest. Staphylococcus suffered. Streptococcus suffered. The organisms that made wounds fester and made families grieve after simple scratches were cowed. The juice did not do as much to gram-negative organisms like the typhoid bacillus. That was a clue that would become a theme in later practice. Some bacteria have walls that yield to this particular key. Others have doors that it cannot open. He christened the active substance with a name that carried the past and the future in 3 neat syllables. He wrote penicillin on paper that smelled like the bench. Then, true to the way ideas move from a man to a world, he wrote a formal note for a journal. In 1929, the British Journal of Experimental Pathology printed his report. It was not a fanfare. It was a dry description with photographs that showed the clean circles on cloudy fields. He wrote that the substance seemed to be non-toxic to animal tissues, which was a blessing, and that it might be useful in isolating more delicate microbes from mixed cultures, which was practical and modest. He did not write that medicine had changed. The story did not yet know that it had changed. There was a problem. The juice was unstable. It broke down when heated or allowed to sit for long. It did not concentrate easily with the simple tools at hand. Fleming and colleagues named Ridley and Craddock tried to coax it into purity and were defeated by a trick of chemistry. The active ring in the molecule could not be bullied by clumsy methods. The result was that the paper was read and then set aside like a piece of clever clockwork whose spring could not be wound. In the practical life of the hospital, surgeons still reached for antiseptics and nurses still boiled instruments and prayed that the pus would not go from a steady ooze to a sudden redness that moved up a limb like fire. It has become a favorite bit of folklore to say that Fleming was messy and that his mess saved the world. There is a shade of truth and an even darker shade of invention. His bench did look like a place where curiosity and housekeeping were in a lively quarrel. The open window at St. Mary's did let in air that carried surprises. Not far below him, another scientist named Charles Latouche worked with molds and filled the building with spores that would have made a fussy man wrap every plate twice. Whether the penicillium that landed on Fleming's dish came from Latouche, or from a stray fruit, or from a careless sleeve, is a question that cannot be solved. We know only that a spore found a home in late summer, and that an eye trained by years of watching bacterial lawns fail and flourish recognized that something new had happened on a very old battlefield. The substance itself was clever, in a way that always seems marvelous once the secret is told. Bacteria build their walls by lacing together chains of molecules to make a net around themselves. Penicillin slips into that process and jams it, so that a dividing bacterium opens itself to a world of pressure and bursts. It is a simple trick with elegant timing. It is also a trick that only works when the target is growing. That is why a doctor must tell a patient to keep taking pills even after a fever falls. The stragglers that are still dividing must be caught as they divide, or they will return with cousins who remember the attack and know how to shrug. After the paper, quiet, or rather, life as usual, which for a bacteriologist is never quiet. Eating and breathing are always telling you something if you listen close. Fleming kept working on lysozyme and on the broader question of how to bend microbes to human need without scalding the human at the same time. Hospitals kept burying people who would have lived in a world with a better potion. In the 1930s, a German dye house gave birth to the first of the sulfonamide drugs. Gerhard Domach found that a red dye called Prontosil could cure mice of streptococcal infections. The French stripped the dye part away and found that the active soul of the drug was a simple chemical that could be made in a flask. These medicines saved lives. They also failed often when bacteria had a head start or a barricade or a talent for making pus thick. Something else was still needed. Something that could find and bind the bricklayers of the bacterial wall, and with a tug, bring the whole wall down. The second act of the penicillin story begins not with a bench in Paddington, but with a courtyard in Oxford, where pigeons sometimes left their opinions on a very fine building. Howard Florey, an Australian-born pathologist with a gift for organization, and Ernst Chain, a Jewish émigré from Berlin with a mind that could move as fast as his fingers, began to work through old papers in search of ignored clues. They found Fleming's report. Chain did not take much on faith. He designed a way to make penicillin out of the mold in quantities that could be measured and tested. A young researcher named Norman Heatley brought a craftsman's genius to the work. He designed apparatus from milk churns and bedpans and bits of glass that could coax the delicate compound into solutions that held their punch. He invented a method of back extraction to move penicillin from water into amyl acetate and back into water, which let the team concentrate it without killing it. In a time of wartime shortages, they improvised and they smiled when something rattled into life and made a faint smell of fruit. The first tests were merciless and fair. Mice that had been injected with lethal doses of streptococci were divided into two groups. One group received the new extract. The other group received nothing. The treated animals lived. The untreated died. The contrast was brutal and beautiful. Here was a substance that chose a side in a long war and did not mistake tissue for enemy. The next step was human and dangerous. In February of 1941, the team treated a policeman named Albert Alexander, who had scratched his face while pruning roses and fallen into a cascade of infections that medicine and prayer could not reverse. They began penicillin and watched fever fall and symptoms ease. There was too little drug. They tried to recover penicillin from his urine to give it back, a trick that works because kidneys discard what is not used and penicillin leaves the body fast. It was not enough. The supply failed, and so did the patient. The story breaks the heart every time it is told, and it steals the nerve because it taught the team that the drug worked in the way that mattered most, and that what they lacked was not a principle, but a factory. Factories need feed. During the war, the United States built one around a product that no one outside a mill had ever thought heroic. At a government lab in Peoria, Illinois, researchers discovered that corn steep liquor, a sticky byproduct of making cornstarch, fed penicillium so well that the fungus gave more of the substance that Oxford had proved could save a life. A woman named Mary Hunt brought a cantaloupe to the lab whose skin carried a Penicillium chrysogenum strain that made even more. The staff teased and called her Moldy Mary. A better title would be Patron Saint of Fortunate Fruit. With the new strain and the new medium, yields rose further. Then engineers at Pfizer and other firms figured out how to grow the mold, not just in shallow trays, but in deep tanks with bubbles and agitation that allowed oxygen to find every filament. The industry invented a way to make gallons where the bench had made teaspoons. By 1943, penicillin could be given to treat soldiers with infections from wounds that would once have eaten an arm or taken a life. By the time of the landings in France in 1944, the drug was traveling in crates that were nearly as precious as ammunition. Mortality from bacterial infections in wounded soldiers fell. The medicine moved from the front to the home and began to cure childhood pneumonias and the fevers that ran up from an infected childbirth. In 1942 at New Haven Hospital, a woman named Ann Miller survived postpartum sepsis after receiving what may have been the first therapeutic dose of penicillin in the United States. It is a mark of how quickly a success becomes an expectation that within a decade, such cures were no longer news. The honors that follow revolutions have their own schedule. In 1945, the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine was awarded to Fleming, Florey, and Chain. The roll call did not include Norman Heatley, whose improvisations made the jump from clever dish to bottle possible, and so it did not include him on the grand stage. Some wrongs are corrected later by historians with pens. Fleming accepted the honor with a warning. He told an audience that if one gave a too small dose, or if patients stopped too early, bacteria would learn to live with the drug and would teach their children that trick. This was not a priestly scold, but a scientist's description of a law as strict as gravity. Use changes the world, and the world answers. By the late 1940s, hospitals were already reporting Staphylococcus strains that shrugged at the drug that had once humbled them. The next act of the antibiotic era would be a dance in which chemistry and microbe would take turns. There are side paths where the curious linger. A young Frenchman named Ernest Duchenne had observed in 1897 that mold could push back against bacteria, and he submitted a thesis on the subject that did not rock any boats. In the 1870s, Joseph Lister had noted that cultures sometimes refused to grow when certain molds were present. These observations were like sparks that fell on wet wood. They warmed and then went out. Fleming's gift was a preparedness of mind and a position in a medical world ready to try again. The war forced industry to move faster than it would have under any other pressure. A scientist in a busy London hospital, a team in Oxford who shared credit like water from a well, a fruit found in a market in Peoria, a factory in Brooklyn that embraced deep tanks and risk, all of them make their way into a story that begins with a dish left out by a window. Walk back into that room in 1928 and tilt the plate in the light. The halo is a quiet thing. It is not a trumpet. It is a line between death and life, drawn in a circle, thin as a wedding band. It invited questions, and it rewarded patience. It would be years before the circle became a vial, and the vial became a routine. But that is often how an age changes. A single eye finds a single thing and refuses to look away. Then machines are built around that refusal, and the thing becomes a tool that other hands can use. Fleming did not keep a tidy bench. He kept a tidy curiosity. He had the habit of asking what a mistake might be trying to say. He had a mentor who allowed him to tinker, and a hospital that allowed him to claim space and time for work that did not pay in ready headlines. He had bad luck with the chemistry and good luck with the spores. He had, perhaps most of all, the ability to tell the world in a paragraph that something worth hearing had happened in a dish. The rest of us have had nearly a century to live inside that paragraph. It smells of agar and summer and the old wood of a sash window, and when it opens, the wards grow quiet in a way that once was rare. The Saturday night shift at Unit 4 began with the kind of routine that makes a large machine feel human. In the corridor, the paint smelled faintly of oil. The turbines down the hall hummed at a pitch that engineers recognize the way musicians recognize a key. Valves chattered quietly. Gauges winked. On the control room panels, the lights made a small constellation on a field of grey. The men in white coats and soft shoes moved between their instruments as if they were tending an orchestra that never slept. Above and below them sat the stack of steel and water and graphite that made electricity by turning water to steam, and steam to motion, and motion to light. It was a Soviet machine, an RBMK 1000, designed to do two things at once. It could boil water for a generator, and if needed, yield plutonium for other uses. It was large, clever, and unlike the Western reactors that wrapped themselves inside thick steel vessels like a ship inside a bottle, this one was a block of graphite with channels for fuel and coolant, a kind of giant furnace with a neat geometry and a temper that could be guessed at but not fully known by the men on that floor. The test scheduled for that night had a practical purpose. In a total power loss, a nuclear plant must keep its coolant pumps running while diesel generators start and come up to speed. The test would see whether the spinning turbine, allowed to coast down with the steam valves closed, could generate enough electrical current for the pumps in those crucial seconds. The idea was sound. The timing was poor. The test had been planned for the day shift with the most experienced operators. A request from the electrical grid to keep the plant at power delayed the run. By the time Unit 4 was freed to reduce load, the day shift had gone home, and the night crew had inherited a complicated procedure with too little time to think it through and too much pressure to perform it anyway. Lowering power in a large graphite-moderated reactor is not like dimming a lamp. It requires coaxing the core through a delicate passage where nuclear poisons build up and then fade away. When operators brought the power down, the reactor passed through a zone where xenon gas accumulated inside fuel channels and soaked up neutrons that would otherwise keep the reaction humming. This xenon poisoning is a well-understood phenomenon. It can be handled by patience and by the careful use of control rods. On that night, patience was in short supply. For reasons that later would be analyzed again and again, the thermal power fell far below the intended point, to a tiny fraction of the normal level. That deep drop made the core sullen. The operators, led by a senior engineer with a hard gaze and a short temper, began to withdraw control rods to coax the power back up. They pulled far too many. The rules said that dozens of rods should always sit inside the core as a reserve. By the time the power crept up to a level that would let the test proceed, only a handful of rods remained inserted. The machine was now like a team of horses whose reins had been thrown into the dust. Other measures that night weakened the margin further. To set up the test, automatic safety systems were switched off or bypassed. Protection signals that would have shut the reactor down in an instant were inhibited so that the rundown could be measured without the turbine being tripped by a sensor that did not know the plan. Emergency core cooling was set to manual to prevent it from cutting in at a moment that would spoil the data. None of these was secret tricks. They were steps written in a procedure that assumed an ideal core and a perfect crew. The difference lay in the drift from the ideal. By the time the sequence began, the reactor was full of unstable zones where some channels were on the edge of boiling and others were still cool and heavy with water. The RBMK design had another trait that mattered, and it was one that many operators did not fully grasp because the details were held too closely by the designers. In a water-moderated reactor, steam bubbles in the core often reduce reactivity because they displace the water that helps slow neutrons to the speeds at which they split atoms efficiently. In that graphite-moderated core, steam had the opposite effect. As water boiled away in small regions, the graphite kept doing the work of moderation. The steam bubbles reduced the absorption that water provides, which let reactivity climb. This positive void coefficient meant that once the core began to produce more steam, the reaction would tend to amplify itself unless something intervened. It is a trait that can be controlled by design and by operation, but not by guesswork. On that night, guesswork began to run the show. At 23 minutes past 1 in the morning, the test commenced. Valves on the steam lines to the turbine closed. The big generator began to coast. As it slowed, the pumps that move water through the core were fed less power and began to slow as well. Flow fell, steam formed. In the control room, the men saw power begin to rise and instruments behave oddly. Accounts from that minute differ on who said what and when the tone changed from confidence to alarm. The order is clear enough. A senior man shouted for an emergency shutdown. The operator responsible for the control rods pressed the large square button labeled AZ-5. The command sent every control rod down into the core at once. In most reactors, that command is the end of a story. Here it was the beginning of a new and deadly chapter. The upper sections of the control rods in this design carried graphite displacers. As they entered the core, they pushed water aside before the boron segments bit into the neutron flux. For a few seconds at the insertion path, a burst of reactivity flashed from channels that had been starved. The reactor surged. There is a moment in many disasters when physics and human intention part company. If you could stand outside time, you would see it as a single second that grows like a bubble and swallows the next few seconds as well. In the control room, there was a roar like a freight train entering a station. In the hall that fed steam to the turbines, there was a groan and a shudder. In the reactor hall above the core, the 1,000-ton lid that sat on the stack of graphite and fuel shifted as pressure raced up through channels built for calm flow. Then a steam explosion lifted the lid and wrecked pipes and channels that tried to keep the core neat. A second explosion followed seconds later, probably from hydrogen, created by superheated water-meeting materials that gladly robbed it of oxygen to make a new gas that needed only a spark to find its voice. The roof of the building was torn open. Graphite blocks that had been a chessboard to manage neutrons now lay on the ground like dark loaves, hot to the eye and hotter to the Geiger counters that still worked. The men who first responded did not know that the reactor had been destroyed. They had been taught that such a thing was impossible, that the machine had so many layers of protection that failure would look like a cold shutdown, not like a bonfire. Firefighters arrived within minutes. Their engines rolled along the plant road, and the crews pulled hoses with the muscle memory that every city depends on when sirens sound at night. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik and his men climbed a stair to the roof of an adjacent building to fight the flames. Some of them picked up hunks of black material and tossed them aside as if they were bricks. They were graphite from the core. Their gloves smoked. They tasted metal. Their throats burned with a feeling that they could not place. The word radiation was not in their call sheets. In the control room, a senior operator sent men to turn valves by hand and to push water wherever it could be pushed. One of those men was Valery Kodymchuk, who had been near the pumps when the floor tore. He was never found. He remains where the core once stood. In the city of Pripyat, a few kilometers away, windows trembled with the force of the explosions. Families looked up and saw a red glow at the plant, and a pillar of something that looked like the aurora risen from the earth instead of from the sky. Some watched from bridges where the night air felt fresh after the day's warmth. They did not know that the glow came from the air itself being ionized, and that the specks that glittered were particles hot, with isotopes that could settle in thyroids and bones, and leave their signature behind for years. In the early hours, ambulances began to shuttle firemen and operators to a clinic. The doctors saw burns that did not behave like the ones they had learned to dress. They treated the men and wrote notes and handed out morphine, because that is what one does when a man who has done his duty lies looking puzzled and in pain. In that first dawn, the plant managers and officials tried to impose their will on a situation that no one had trained for. Dosimeters on hand had ranges that topped out far below the actual fields on the roof and around the wreckage. The instruments pegged and refused to tell their keepers how bad it was. Larger range devices existed but were locked away or not being used because their presence had always been a reminder of unlikely danger. Reports went up the chain of command that suggested a manageable accident. Water was pumped bravely by men who waded waist-deep in basements that glowed with invisible trouble. Within hours, Moscow began to understand that something extraordinary had happened. The secrecy that had covered design flaws now covered the disaster. Evacuation of Pripyat was delayed. Families were told to gather in the afternoon of the next day and to bring documents and a small bag. Buses lined the streets. The voice on the radio asked for calm and promised to return in a few days. Most of those people never came back. Beyond the borders of the Soviet Union, the story broke in an almost comical way that turned grim when the details arrived. On Monday morning, alarms sounded at a nuclear plant in Sweden. Workers arriving for their shift set off monitors that sniffed their shoes and their hair and their lunch pails. The plant itself was clean. The air was not. Instruments found isotopes that could only have come from fuel. The Swedes notified neighbors and reached out to Moscow. That evening, a brief announcement on state television admitted that an accident had occurred at a plant in Ukraine. The images that followed in later days, of helicopters dropping bags of sand and boron over a burning hole, of armored vehicles hosing streets, of men in white clothes and rubber boots moving quickly and silently, made a new kind of news. The General Secretary spoke later with gravity. The world learned a new geography. Pripyat, Chernobyl, a 30-kilometer zone. Contamination maps with green and yellow and a frightening red. Inside the plant and on the grounds, heroism became a job description. The fear that molten fuel might eat through the floor and find water below led to a decision to drain the bubbler pools and other spaces. A group of workers, including Alexei Ananenko and Valery Bespalov and their supervisor Boris Baranov, went into the dark carrying lamps and their nerve. They opened valves and let the water out. For a long time, the story had them as doomed divers. In fact, they lived, but their walk through that night remains one of the bravest acts in a story full of them. On the roofs around the destroyed reactor, robots sent to push debris into the hole failed because the radiation wrecked their electronics. Soldiers were sent up in their place. They wore lead under their clothing. They carried shovels. They were allowed up for less than 2 minutes at a time. They became the so-called bio-robots. A siren blew at the end of each brief shift. The men would come down and pull off their clothes and shoes and step into a shower while a Geiger counter scolded. Their faces in the photographs looked like the faces of men who have been told a lie and decided to keep going anyway. The fire at the core, which had enough graphite and fuel to burn in a sinister way, was eventually smothered by tons of material. The air above the site stank of chemicals and dust. The workers who had been exposed early and the firemen who had picked up graphite went to hospitals in Moscow where specialists in radiation medicine tried everything they knew. Many died within days or weeks of acute radiation syndrome. The official count of those early deaths usually runs to a few dozen. Later years brought other numbers, harder to pin down because cancer has many causes. Thyroid cancers in children of the region rose sharply from the iodine that had settled on pastures and moved into milk and then into bodies. The total human cost can never be properly counted. Demography is a blunt tool for grief. The Soviet style of making electricity had encouraged a habit of secrecy that bit hard into the bone of this event. Operators were not fully informed about the design's quirks. Manuals were not made to teach the worst case, because the worst case was not supposed to exist. A culture that punished bad news with anger and demotion taught people to hide bad news, or to make it sound like a detail. That culture met a machine that had been built with a blind spot, and a test that had been shuffled to a shift that had not prepared for it. The men in the control room were not villains. They were confident and proud. They had worked within a system that rewarded output and punctuality and faith in a diagram on a wall. They had taken shortcuts that others had taken, on the understanding that the machine could forgive a few bends in the rules. That night, the machine did not forgive. In the months that followed, a sarcophagus of steel and concrete was built around the gutted unit. The wind blew dust from work sites. The cranes swung, and idle men smoked while waiting for their next order. The structure was assembled with the speed of fear and the strength of what was at hand. It did the job of keeping the weather out and the worst of the dust in. Years later, a larger shelter would be built on rails and slid into place over the first. Even this new cover is an admission that our machines sometimes demand monuments to our mistakes. The zone around the plant grew peculiarly quiet. Wolves and wild horses and birds nested in buildings where people had once slept. Nature never truly heals a place like that. It simply moves in and keeps its appointments. The nuclear world learned hard lessons. International conventions on notification and safety were strengthened. Training manuals elsewhere now begin with the test that failed and the reasons why. Reactors of the same class were modified with new control rods, with changes to the graphite tips, with operating rules that would keep the positive void effect from becoming a scythe. The words "safety culture" became a phrase with teeth instead of a slogan one recites to visitors. Engineers everywhere began to speak more openly about risk and about the human factors that turn a diagram into a bad morning news report. The story of Chernobyl became a parable in classrooms and in control rooms, in politics and in families that wondered what might drift on the wind toward their fields. Return in imagination to that control room at 1:01 in the morning. A young operator with a phone at his ear looks to a senior man for permission. The senior man does not want to give up on a test that has been delayed all day by other people. A supply grid 200 kilometers away has asked for more electricity and is now asleep. A pencil taps on a panel. A button is pressed. A design flaw meets a chain of human choices and the air learns to glow. The small decisions of the evening cannot be taken back. Neither can the decision taken years before to keep certain facts behind a wall of clearance. The men in that room could not see the burning roof as the people on the bridge could. They read their instruments, and at the very end, those instruments lied. History is sometimes a stack of safety measures lowered one by one until the final guardrail is a tired person doing his best in a bad moment. The night at Chernobyl is one of those stacks. It is about a test meant to make a plant safer, carried out under conditions that made it dangerous. It is about a machine whose designers kept secrets from the men who had to manage it at 3 in the morning. It is about a response that moved with courage and with a denial that cost real hours. Above all, it is about the old truth that nature is patient and the margin for error is not. On the evening of June 5th, 1944, a low sky pressed on the channel. Rain came in bursts. Wind ran hard from the west, and white caps shouldered across the grey water like cattle in a hurry. In a cottage at Southwick House near Portsmouth, a Scottish meteorologist named James Stagg unfolded maps and spoke careful sentences to an American general who had the habit of listening with his head bent forward. The weather, said Stagg, would ease by morning. Not fair and bright, but bearable. The wind would drop. The cloud would lift to a low ceiling, and there would be a small window in which ships could cross and gliders could land. Dwight Eisenhower looked at the faces in the room, asked a few questions, and said the two words that sent a continent of men into motion. He said that they would go. Across the water in France, other men looked at a different sky and read it with less hope. The German forecasters had fewer ocean stations and fewer ships reporting. Their voice in the Atlantic had been weakened by the long war. They saw only a heavy system that would stick for days. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, who had been given responsibility for the coast of northern France under the overall command of the older man, Karl von Rundstedt, drew a practical conclusion. He believed that no competent enemy would launch an armada in such weather, and that a day with wind and rain would be a day without invasion. He left his headquarters near La Roche-Guyon to travel inland to Herlingen to see his wife on her birthday and to bring her a gift that he had chosen with a husband's pride, a pair of shoes from Paris. He also planned to meet Hitler the next day to argue again for more freedom to move the armored reserve that he believed must sit close to the beaches. He had spent months insisting that the first hours of any landing would decide the campaign. In those hours, he wanted to throw tanks at the surf line and push the boats back into the water before the bridgeheads could harden. He left the line at the moment when hours mattered. The coast he had spent those months fortifying was a belt of concrete, steel, and imagination that the German press named the Atlantic Wall. In truth, it was a patchwork, stronger where fear of attack was greatest, flimsy where staff officers thought the sea and the tides and the distance would do the work. In the Pas de Calais, where the channel is narrow and the white cliffs stare at each other across a moat, bunkers and batteries crowded the headlands. In Normandy, they were fewer and more scattered. But Rommel had made that ground painful even in its gaps. He had planted mines in their millions. He had ordered iron and timber obstacles to be set in the tidal flats, each one crowned with a mine, so that a landing craft advancing on a rising tide would break its hull or explode before it hit beach. He had filled meadows with wooden poles to skewer gliders, the asparagus that gave the fields their new name. He had built fortins and radar posts and gun pits, and waited for a morning he could not predict. Another argument had been running since the winter inside the German mind. Rommel and Rundstedt disagreed about doctrine the way men disagree about philosophy. Rundstedt and the men who served as his armored advisors, including Gehr von Schweppenberg, believed that the best way to meet a landing was to hold powerful armored divisions inland, safe from naval guns, and then move them as a mass to the point of danger and sweep the beach clean with a single blow. Rommel had seen the raw strength of Allied air power in North Africa and in Italy. He believed that no armored mass could move by day under that sky, and that a railroad of bomb craters and strafing runs would cut the sinews of any counterattack. Place the panzers near the water, he argued, because only there could they arrive on time. Hitler, who kept busy men busy with his interference, split the difference and made it worse. He kept some panzer divisions under the direct control of the High Command in the east, and he refused to allow them to move without his personal word. He then slept late on the morning when his word was wanted. As evening turned to night, an armada without public equal in history began to leave British harbors. The assault phase of Operation Overlord was called Neptune, and it carried 5 landing divisions in its first wave, with 3 airborne divisions going before them in the dark. The beaches wore names that men gripped like talismans: Utah and Omaha for the Americans, Gold, Juno, and Sword for the British and the Canadians. The airborne troops crossed the coast of France first, in Dakotas and in wooden gliders, and dropped or skidded through fields and orchards that were small and bounded by thick hedgerows, the bocage that would prove a kind of second enemy in the weeks ahead. Paratroopers scattered by wind and cloud rallied themselves by grit and accident, and did the work they had been trained to do. They seized bridges near Sainte-Mère-Église. They took causeways over the flooded lowlands behind Utah and cleared paths for the men who would be waist-deep in water by dawn. In the British sector, Major John Howard and his glider company landed beside the Cayenne Canal and the Orne and captured the bridges there so exactly on their mark that a plaque would one day call one of them Pegasus. They held until relieved in the way that soldiers use the word as both a duty and a prayer. Before first light, the Allied naval guns began to speak. Battleships and cruisers that had spent years guarding convoys now fired at concrete and earth with shells the size of small cars. On Omaha, where the cliffs hung over a shingle gentle enough to lure a planner into optimism, the bombardment missed too many of the strong points. The 35th Wehrmacht Division had been reinforced without Allied planners knowing, and the guns in those positions had good fields of fire and crews with crisp nerves. When the first waves came ashore, they found a killing ground and a tide coming in behind them. Boats hung on obstacles and exploded. Men waded and stumbled. The medics pulled the living by their belts and left the dying with a look and a squeeze they would remember forever. The generals later said that the day hung by an eyelash at Omaha, and any sober reader of the accounts can see why they say it. At Utah, a current and a mistake had carried the 1st Battalions a little south of the planned sector. Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. looked around at the gentler beach and made a choice that saved lives. "We will start the war from here," he said, and sent for the rest to follow. Along Sword and Juno, the British and Canadians fought their own bitter tides. German gunners in reinforced nests fired until naval shells ripped the nests apart. On Juno, Canadians were held up by seawalls and mines, and then pushed inland with a force that startled the opposition and started their race toward Seine. At Sword, British units took the beach and moved to join the airborne men near the bridges. The obstacle belt that Rommel had designed caused casualties, but the lowering tide and the work of assault engineers with Bangalore torpedoes and with charges and sheer courage broke lanes through. The advantages of the weather window that Stagg had promised were not theatrical. The cloud lifted just enough for fighter bombers to work. The wind dropped just enough to allow craft to beach and to back away. It did not save men caught in the wrong ditch or on the wrong part of the sand. It did make victory fit inside a day that could have been a defeat. The German response on that morning bore the marks of the quarrels and the absence. 7th Army under Dolman controlled the coastal corps in Normandy. The 21st Panzer Division near Caen was the only armored unit that could be ordered at once. Its commander, Edgar Feuchtinger, was a political general more polished than experienced. He sent Kampfgruppen toward the beaches and toward the airborne bridgeheads piecemeal. One column reached as far as the coast between Sword and Juno in the late afternoon, and men on the water saw tanks and half-tracks near the sand, a sight that must have made more than one stomach turn. Those German units then pulled back rather than be cut off by British paratroopers and incoming reinforcements. The armored divisions that Rommel had wanted near the water lay farther back. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend near Lisieux and the Panzer Lehr Division near Le Mans were trained and proud and ready to move, but they could not move without permission. The order to release them waited on Hitler, who woke late at his house in the mountains and was told after 9 that the landings were happening. By then, British and American soldiers had been on French soil for hours, and the tide was filling their supply dumps with rifles and bandages and bulldozers. Deception had also been at work, and it did not sleep that night. The Allies had built a phantom army on the map of England opposite Calais and put General George Patton at its head in a piece of theatre called Fortitude. Fake tanks of canvas and wood sat in fields, radio nets chattered with fiction, and double agents sent to German handlers the news that Calais was the real target and Normandy a feint. Even on June 6th, as reports showed the truth, the German 15th Army remained in the north, along the Pas de Calais, waiting for the blow it had been taught to dread. The delay of those divisions kept a fist idle within range of the beaches where it could have mattered. Rommel returned from his wife's birthday by car. On the road, he saw lines of additional aircraft flying inland and columns of smoke over the coast. He drove faster, furious at the complacency that had settled over headquarters and at his own absence. He moved between command posts and urged commanders to strike what they could strike. He found what he had feared in his bones. The air was an ocean of danger, crisscrossed by fighter bombers that searched roads for movement and bridged the hours between dawn and dusk with a kind of predatory patience. Any armored thrust that did not begin at sunup would have to creep. He sent urgent messages for release of the panzer divisions and found that permission was a river with many bends. The 7th Army tried to assemble units for a night counterattack that would aim at the British sector and perhaps cut the bridges at the Orne. It did not gather in time. The enemy did not sleep. The night that followed was raked by naval guns that fired illuminated rounds and put sheets of molten light across the fields. Could his presence at dawn have changed the first day? It is a question made to be argued at tables. Rommel's supporters later said that he would have thrown 21st Panzer with more deliberation and more concentration, that he would have bullied higher command to release the divisions earlier, that he would have put his weight on a needed hinge. His critics answer that the weight of ships and planes and men mattered more than the presence of a single general. What cannot be dismissed is the chain of small things that took shape under a heavy sky. Rommel believed the weather made an invasion impossible and left. Rundstedt did not insist that the Panzer Reserve be placed within a morning's drive of every beach. Hitler slept and held the keys to army doors as if they were toys. A deception plan kept the strongest formations in the wrong place. In that chain, the birthday trip was one link. Remove it, and the chain still holds. Keep it, and you have one more instance of how certainty about the world can be a kind of blindness. The Allies had their mistakes too, and they cost lives as surely as any enemy shot. Paratroopers dropped miles from their zones, waged small wars in small villages, and were killed in ditches that no one recorded. On Omaha, the planners had underestimated the defenses and had to learn in blood how to correct their sums. A flotilla of German torpedo boats slipped out of Le Havre and hit with a precision that nighttime training had taught. One coaster, the Norwegian destroyer Svena, was struck and sunk. The sea carries every nation in its arms when the guns fire. By the night of June 6th, the beachheads were joined. Caen did not fall. Carrington did not fall. The road network had not been broken apart as Rommel had planned for months. The men on the beaches began to come ashore with larger machines and heavier guns. The Mulberry artificial harbors that were towed in pieces across the channel began to be assembled. Piers grew where there had been surf. Fuel lines were laid underwater to bring petrol to the shore without jamming the roads. Every step brought the next step. Every minute, an officer in a German command post needed to find his superior for a permission slip was a minute turned to Allied favor. There is a photograph of Rommel taken earlier that spring along the coast, standing with hands on hips while a gust of wind lifts his coat. and he stares at the sea through field glasses. He looks like a man willing the future to honor his plan. The future did not. The storm did not last as long as he counted on. The window that Stagg had found was just wide enough for courage. The man who had made his name by moving faster than the enemy in the desert was trapped by a chain of command made to highlight another man's need to be asked. He tried to correct the error as only a field marshal can, with orders and energy and that rare personal touch that makes subordinates believe they can do what physics says is almost impossible. He was too late. By the end of June, the battle in Normandy had become a struggle through hedgerows where every lane was a trench and every field a small fortress. The influence of that first day lingered like the smell of cordite in a room. A birthday and a barometer had helped shape it. The Allies had trusted a window and dared to cross. The Germans had trusted a storm and slept. The men who paid for those acts of trust lay in sand and soil from Sainte-Mère-Église to La Brèche. They were the ones who gave weight to ideas. In the small hours of March 30th, 1867, a carriage stopped at a townhouse on Lafayette Square in Washington City. Inside, lamps were trimmed, a coal fire ticked in the grate, and a man still haunted by the night of Lincoln's murder waited in a silk robe with the stubborn patience of a practiced negotiator. William Henry Seward, Secretary of State of the United States, had a jaw that set like a clasp when he decided to do something. He had survived the knife of an assassin 2 years before, when a conspirator broke into his home the same night the president was shot. The attack had left scars on his body and a fixed idea in his mind about the reach and future of his country. Expansion was not a fever to him. It was the long arithmetic of geography and power. His guest that night was Edouard de Stockel, Minister of His Imperial Majesty, the Tsar of all the Russias. De Stockel had a reputation for charm, a talent for gifts, and a direct line to St. Petersburg. He had crossed back and forth between capital and court with the regularity of a post rider for more than a decade. He knew Seward well. He also knew what his masters desired. The Romanov dynasty had decided to sell its distant province across the Bering Strait, a land of mountains and rivers and islands that Russian charts called Russian America, and that American charts showed as a faint green beyond British Canada. The decision did not come from romance. It came from war and from ledgers. Russia's power had been tried by the Crimean War in the 1850s. British and French fleets had blockaded sea routes. The empire learned that distance could suddenly become a weakness when enemies have steamships and you have to move supplies across Siberia with sledges. Russian America brought in furs through the chartered Russian-American Company, but the sea otter had been hunted hard since the days when Vitus Bering's expedition opened that coast to traders in 1741. Profits fell. Ports were thinly held. To the south sat British possessions whose governors could, in a new war, send cruisers to pluck the colony like a ripe fruit. Better, the Tsar's advisors argued, to turn a vulnerable asset into cash and goodwill. Better to cultivate friendship with the United States as a counterweight to the British Empire on the same continent. There had been talk of a sale before the Civil War. The war placed all such ideas under a tarp. When it ended, the proposition jogged back into the light. The most energetic American for the idea was the man with the injured jaw. Seward thought in continents. As a young senator, he had spoken of a nation that would one day hold the keys to the Pacific. He had tried and failed to buy islands in the Caribbean and a slice of Greenland. He had talked about Hawaii as if it were a cousin whose visit was overdue. Alaska as Americans already called the place by an aloof name, seemed to him like a piece that would lock others into place later. De Stockel arrived at Seward's house that night with instructions and with the confidence of a man who believed that his government was offering a bargain that prudence should accept quickly. The two men dined and then set to work with maps and pens. The story has the air of theatre because it happened in one long stretch before dawn. They haggled a little and then wrote a number that now seems like a typographical error. $7,200,000 for an expanse so large that a man could walk from the Panhandle to the Bering Sea for weeks and still be in it. The price worked out to a few cents an acre. Paper moved from a desk to a messenger. Before the sun rose, President Andrew Johnson had approved the deal, and a special session of the Senate was in the making. Opposition arrived on cue. In the United States, the newspapers that disliked Johnson or Seward found the easiest punchline of the decade. They called the territory a burden of ice and fog, and laughed at the vision of American taxpayers footing bills to protect polar bears and walruses. The language was playful and cutting. Seward's folly. Seward's icebox. Johnson's polar bear garden. Cartoonists drew mountains, piled with snow, and little figures stamping their feet in a cold wind, while dollar bills fluttered into the tundra. The criticism also had a practical edge. The nation was still angry and broke from the war. The work of reconstruction made every other project look suspect or selfish. There were regions of the continental United States that needed the federal government to build roads and protect settlers. Why buy an attic full of snow when the parlor needed patching? Seward did what patient men do, he explained. He invited senators to see the shape of the world on a globe. He whispered to editors. He praised the Russian friendship shown during the Civil War, when Russian fleets had visited New York and San Francisco, and reminded readers that a Europe which had hesitated to help the Confederacy had at least watched Washington with more warmth because of St. Petersburg. He counted votes. When the Senate of the United States took up the treaty on April 9th, it ratified the purchase 37-2. In an age when treaties could languish for months, that was a sprint. The text of the agreement said that the inhabitants would be admitted to the enjoyment of the rights of citizens, except indigenous tribesmen who would be subject to laws later adopted. The sentence was written in the manner of the time, with a lawyer's comma hiding within it a large injustice. The Tlingit and the Haida and the Yupik and the Aleut had not been asked about the transfer of sovereignty over their lands. They would learn to live under new laws that were often enforced with the rough hand of a distant government. On the Russian side, the sale was celebrated as a clever move. The minister de Stockel was recalled to Russia with honors and a handsome pension. He had also, according to later accusations, distributed gifts in Washington to ease the bill along. That would not have surprised anyone who knew the lubricants of 19th century diplomacy. In any case, the money arrived. The Treasury issued a warrant, and the sum was paid in London through bankers in gold. On October 18, 1867, warships anchored off New Archangel, the capital of Russian America, that Americans would soon call Sitka. The transfer ceremony took place on a hill above the harbor. The Russian flag was lowered, and the double-headed eagle looked down from its cloth for the last time. There is a story that the halyard fouled, and a sailor climbed the pole to free it, and then stuffed the flag into his tunic, rather than let it touch the hands of his new neighbors. The American flag went up, and a detachment of soldiers fired a salute. A banquet was held. Tlingit leaders were not invited to the table that decided the terms. In the months that followed, American officers learned that governing the new possession would be less a picnic than a winter job in a warehouse. It was first administered by the Army, then the Treasury Department, then the Navy. Civil government of a kind did not arrive until the early 20th century. Was it a mistake for Russia? The answer depends on which calendar you prefer. In the calendar of 1867, the sale made sense. The Russian court had cash needs and strategic anxieties. The fur trade that had drawn Alexander Baranov and the Russian-American company into the region had collapsed in many areas from overhunting and from the fact that fashion no longer beat as strongly for otter. The sea lanes that connected Sitka to Kamchatka and St. Petersburg were long and exposed. To defend a colony like that in a war with Britain would be like defending a barn with a match and a prayer. To sell to the United States increased the chance that British Canada would remain capped to the west by a friendly power rather than an enemy. Grand Duke Constantine, the Tsar's brother and a patron of naval reform, urged the sale as a plain solution to a plain problem. In the calendar of the next century, the sale looks like the bargain of an age. Riches came. Some took a while to show. Some had been sitting in the water all along. The salmon and cod fisheries would feed fleets and towns. Copper and gold would pour out of mines that carved mountains into geometry. At Kennicott in the 1910s, ore carts carried some of the purest copper found anywhere on Earth. Nome and Fairbanks were born out of hard luck and river bars, part of a craze that began across the border with the Canadian Klondike in 1896 and spilled over every ridge until men were setting claims with mittened hands on beaches where the surf glittered with flakes. The story of Balto and the serum run in 1925, when dog teams carried antitoxin to Nome through winter storms, became part of a folklore in which distance made heroes out of ordinary courage. Then oil arrived. In 1968, exploratory wells on the North Slope found the Prudhoe Bay field, a pool so large that maps cannot easily make the numbers legible. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline was built across mountains and permafrost to carry crude south to the ice-free port of Valdez. It is one of those projects that is both a feat and a scar. The pipe gleams like a silver thread over the Brooks Range and dips into valleys with the studied grace of an engineer's compromise. Its construction created camps and quarrels and fortunes. The oil that flowed through it altered the budget of the young state and the balance sheet of a nation. For Russia, watching from the other side of the Bering Strait, the sight must have been bittersweet. The empire that had sold for $7,200,000 had let go of resources that would one day be counted in the trillions. Strategic value made its own ledger. In the Second World War, Alaska was not a backwater. Japanese forces struck the Aleutians in 1942. They bombed Dutch Harbor and occupied Kiska and Attu. The Aleutian campaign was fought in fog and wind and on islands that carried tundra and memory. American and Canadian forces retook Attu after a brutal battle in which a final banzai charge killed many on both sides. Kiska was reoccupied without a fight after the enemy slipped away, leaving traps and silence. On other fronts, the region became an aerial bridge to the Soviet Union. Under the Lend-Lease program, American-built aircraft were flown by American crews up through the interior to Fairbanks, handed to Soviet pilots, and flown on to Siberia and the front. A line of airfields scattered across Alaska tells that story in aluminum and windsocks. In the Cold War that followed, the land became a stage for radar and interceptors. Early warning lines arced across the north, and crews at Elmendorf and Eielson waited for blips that would mean visitors from the other side of the pole. On some mornings, American fighters would escort Soviet bombers out over the Bering Sea like polite policemen shepherding tourists away from a museum door. Submarines used the waters for games of skill that only a few men on Earth understood. If Russia had kept Alaska, the geometry of that contest would have been stranger and perhaps uglier. A land border with the United States around the Yukon and along the St. Elias Ranges would have made for a military chessboard with too many squares to watch. The indigenous story that runs through these changes is not tidy. The transfer ignored sovereignty and began decades in which villages were told to move or to accept missions or schools that erased language and lifeways. Yet the people endured and asserted claims with the same endurance they had used to survive on coasts and rivers that are beautiful and cruel in the same hour. In 1971, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act created corporations to hold lands and money for Native shareholders. It was an imperfect instrument, but it recognized at last that history could not pretend that no one had lived there before. The story of Alaska is the story of Tlingit traders whose canoes moved through Sitka Sound and of Inupiat hunters who watched the leads for whales long before a surveyor drove a stake into the ground and said that a line on his paper should be honored as a border. Not all of the early mockery in the American press lasted. Seward was not a man who held grudges in public. He traveled to Alaska in his retirement and rode steamers past glaciers that cracked with reports like artillery. He collected curios and listened to stories and felt confirmed in his view that geography makes policy even when policy forgets geography. October 18th, the day of the transfer at Sitka, became Alaska Day and is still marked with ceremonies that recall the flags on the hill. The old Russian buildings in Sitka, including the Onion Dome of St. Michael's, still stand to remind visitors that this coast once spoke another language first, and that history does not waste its breath even when maps are redrawn. Could Russia have held on and extracted the same value that the United States did? Probably not with the state it was in after Crimea and with the treasury it managed in the reign of Alexander II. Holding a frontier requires more than zeal. It requires money, migrants, and a navy. The Russian-American company had none to spare. Its managers squeezed Aleut hunters for furs and fell into arguments with local leaders whose patience wore thin. The chain of islands in the Aleutians was long, and the ships that ran along it were old. The empire elected, in the clear light of morning, to cash out of an investment that would have cost more to develop than it could afford. In the brutal short term, it was wise. In the long sweep, it was the kind of bargain that becomes a fable told to students by teachers who smile when they say the final number. Stand again in that room with Seward and de Stokel. The clock reads 4. The city outside is quiet. The ink smells sharp. Men who had been enemies 2 years earlier now sit in a parlor and decide the fate of a place that neither of them knows with intimacy. They are sure of themselves for different reasons. One believes in the march of his nation to the west and the north. The other believes in the prudence of a great power that knows where its fingers are numb and where they are nimble. On a hill in Sitka, a flag will stick in its pulleys before it comes down. On beaches at Nome a decade later, men will kneel to wash gravel and find gold that a counting room in St. Petersburg would have valued highly. On the North Slope, a survey team will drive posts into the tussocks while mosquitoes worry their necks and write in their logbooks that there is oil under their boots. When people speak of mistakes that changed history, they often mean follies that fly the flag of pride. Here the story is stranger. In the moment, the sail was rational. In the longer story that nations tell themselves about luck, it became an epitaph for a cautious empire and a benediction for an adventurous republic. The ledger is not only about money, it is about ships that sailed from Dutch harbor to Attu. It is about canneries that smelled of brine, and about a pipeline that hums across a tundra where caribou watch it with dark eyes. It is about a border that might have existed and does not. It is about a minister in a silk waistcoat and a secretary with a scar, sitting with maps while the city sleeps, and deciding that a vast and cold land can change hands if two men sign their names in a good pen. Before dawn on a June morning in 1812, sentries on the west bank of the Niemen River heard the creak of harness and the whisper of thousands of hooves on wet grass. The river ran slow and brown between low banks, tufted with sedge. Mists lifted and showed long lines of men in blue and green and white, the coats of half a continent, all pressed into the service of one man's idea of order. Engineers carried pontoon boats to the water with the solemn care of pallbearers. The first ranks crossed under a sky the color of pewter. Behind them came drums, banners, wagons piled high, and a staff that had learned to live by the clock and the rebuke of a master who slept little and expected much. Napoleon stood with arms folded and eyes narrowed, the posture that made artists reach for charcoal. The emperor would later say the army had never seemed so fine. It was large enough to fill 2 countries with boots and still have men waiting on the far bank for their turn to step on a plank. He had not come to Russia for glory alone. The campaign grew from a nest of quarrels left after treaties that were supposed to bind old enemies into new friends. At Tilsit in 1807, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander had met on a raft and smiled in a way that convinced observers that Europe might settle into a new shape. France would be supreme on land, and Britain would keep the seas. Russia would accept the continental system and shut its ports to British trade, a strangling embrace that was supposed to bleed London of credit and sugar and patience. The bargain frayed. Russian nobles who lived on exports saw warehouses fill and debts grow. British goods found their way through neutral flags and through the Baltic, with the connivance of men who joked that a blockade built of paper cutouts would not stop a single barrel of coffee. The Tsar also watched French satellites bloom in places that had once listened for his word. The Duchy of Warsaw looked like a rehearsal for a new Poland, and that was a tune the Romanovs had no wish to hear. There were small insults that stung. A kinsman of the Tsar from Oldenburg was displaced to create yet another client kingdom. Even a royal marriage that joined Napoleon to Marie-Louise of Austria could not mask the fact that the French emperor's map of order required Russia to be a junior partner in a play where France owned the stage. By the spring of 1812, the Grand Army that gathered on the Niemen was more multinational than imperial propaganda liked to admit. The French corps of veterans and conscripts stood at the center. Around them clustered Poles, eager for a chance to strike east and call it liberation. There were Bavarians and Saxons, men from the Confederation of the Rhine, Italians who wore bright uniforms and tried to keep step with officers who dreamed of Caesar, Dutch, and Swiss regiments. Even Spaniards torn from their own bitter war and marched north by necessity. There were hundreds of thousands when the head count was taken on the friendly side of the river. It is a figure that causes the mind to slip. Numbers of that size become a weather pattern. Their needs are as constant as sunrise. Grain, water, shoes, nails, horse fodder, wagons, remounts, cartridges, medical wagons, spare axles, farriers. 1,000 tiny things that keep the living from falling into the ditch. Napoleon had arranged magazines forward at Vilna and Minsk. He had studied roads and distances and sent his commissaries orders that rang with the assurance of a man who had crossed continents and bent them to his will. He also relied on a habit that had served him well in rich countries. He expected to live off the land. Russia is a country where distance is a character and not a backdrop. The Tsar's ministers placed their hopes in that character and in the clear mind of a minister of war who had learned his art in the hard schools of calculation. Michael Barclay de Tolly adopted a plan that invited mockery from officers who preferred thunder to patience. He chose to fall back, to give ground, to refuse the decisive battle that Napoleon always sought, and to trade time for fatigue. Along with Barclay moved Peter Bagratión, brave and stubborn, leading a second army that kept shifting like a fish in a river, always out of the French grasp. Villages burned in their wake. Granaries were emptied or set alight. Bridges were cut. Local officials wrote to governors explaining that they had denied the enemy a bag of grain, and in so doing had denied their own people a winter's comfort. Cossacks visited French outposts at dusk and at dawn, cutting down stragglers, lifting horses, and leaving behind the feeling that no road was safe and no rear truly existed. Already in July, the Grand Army had burned through its good order. Horses began to die at a rate that shocked even veterans of Spain. The campaigns of the previous years had drained the stock of strong animals across Europe. The teams that pulled the heavy guns and wagons in Russia were often underfed and already tired. Fodder was never where the plan said it would be. The heat of that first month raised clouds of dust on the long roads and choked men who were used to the damp cool of France and Germany. Dysentery visited camps with the familiarity of an old friend. When the army reached Vilna, the emperor found a city too small to feed the appetite he had brought with him. He pressed on because pushing on was the one thing that had always saved him when the sums began to go wrong. Smolensk in August offered the first grand promise of battle. The city's white walls and towers stood above the Dnieper, like a past age, judging the present. Napoleon struck at the defenses, and after hard fighting the Russians slipped away, leaving the town to burn and the French to count a victory that tasted thin. The retreat pressed on like a patient forcing a suitor to walk in circles. There were fights at Valutina Gora and at other points along the road where a division might think it had found a chance to grip the enemy at last. Each time, the enemy was smoke and then distance. Russian nobles and officers began to grumble that Barclay de Tolly was a foreigner at heart, and an overcautious one at that. The court answered with an old reflex. The Tsar replaced Barclay with Mikhail Kutuzov, a veteran with a scarred face, who spoke the language of patience in terms that soldiers could stand. Kutuzov gave his army a rest and gave Russia permission to keep retreating until the ground offered the right place to stand. That place was a few dozen miles west of Moscow near a village called Borodino. The Kolocha River wound through low rises. The Russian engineers cut earthworks into the hills and built a series of arrow-shaped positions on the left where Bagration would hold. An open-backed earthwork called the Great Redoubt stood on the right, heavy with guns that could rake any approach. In early September, the armies faced each other across fields of rye and grass, the ground already trampled by skirmishers and artillery limbers. The battle that followed on the 7th began with bombardments that shook the ground and ended with darkness and the smell of dust in the lungs of men who could no longer hear their own voices. Napoleon sent the French left against the Bagration works again and again. The ground changed hands several times in bloody exchanges where regiments destroyed themselves for a copse or a mound. Marshal Ney, fierce and brave, led attacks that drove through smoke and into musket fire, then fell back when new Russian reserves appeared from behind the crests. Murat, a peacock on a field of crows, rode where the fighting was hottest and encouraged cavalry who were beginning to think that glory had a price too dear. On the other flank, the assault on the Great Redoubt became an emblem of the day. French infantry crept close under artillery fire and then broke in with a sudden rush, only to be thrown out by a Russian counterattack with bayonets fixed and drums beating. Then the French came again. When at last the redoubt was taken, the ground inside was a horror of splintered gun carriages and torn bodies and trenches that had become graves. Napoleon watched a battle he could not quite close. He had the old guard in reserve, those men with faces like carved wood who had saved him before when all looked doubtful. He did not commit them. Historians have argued since that afternoon about why. He was sick with a cold and a fever and felt the fog that accompanies illness. He respected the distance he had come and the distance he would have to go back, and feared breaking the last of his strength on a day that would not end the war. He may have believed that the Russians were closer to collapse than they were, and that the morning would find them gone. Whatever the reasons, the guard stood and watched, while thousands of others settled the matter in wrestling matches that lasted until the light failed. Kutuzov withdrew that night, leaving the field to a French army too torn to pursue with eager energy. The losses on both sides were crippling. No clear victor emerged except the graveyard. 4 days later, the French entered Moscow. The city of wooden suburbs and stone houses, with blue domes and golden crosses, was almost empty. Governor Rostopchin had cleared out what he could and sent convicts and police into the shadows with orders that would later become the subject of accusation and defense. Fires broke out that first night and then again on the next. The wind made a bellows of the streets. For days the city burned, while soldiers tried to fight the flames with sand and hooks and prayers. Napoleon took up residence in the Kremlin and waited for a letter or an envoy that would give shape to an armistice. No letter came. The Tsar had made a decision that would cost him more men and more towns, and would win him a country. He would not negotiate while a foreign army sat in his historical capital. Waiting in Moscow became a kind of slow defeat. The French had arrived with little and found less. The surrounding country had been stripped. Cossacks owned the roads that led to any storehouse that had escaped the torch. The horses found only chaff and died in the courtyards where they had been led to water. The soldiers patched uniforms with bits of carpet and velvet pulled from burned parlors. Discipline frayed in ways that made the next stage even harder. The emperor could read a calendar as well as any farmer. He knew that winter would not be a romantic line in a poem. It would be a weight on the chest of every man who tried to march through it without fur and felt and fat. He chose to leave Moscow in mid-October and move south toward Kaluga, where country had not been so ravaged and roads might offer supplies. At Maloye-Roslavets, on a riverbank choked with houses and gardens, his vanguard met Russian troops in a day-long fight that set the town on fire and left ash where anyone might have plans. The road south was blocked. Napoleon turned back to the old road by which he had come, a road that had no food left and few houses with roofs. The retreat had begun, though the army tried to tell itself the word was march. The first snows came early. Frost cut through thin cloth and thin men. The temperature fell and rose and fell again, the worst pattern for bodies that had been starved. Shoes stiffened and then cracked. Men wrapped feet with rags and straw. The sound of the retreat became the sound of wood breaking for fires and of low moans in the dark. Cossacks and peasants with pikes lurked in woods and ditches. Entire companies dissolved overnight. The French burned wagons that would not roll, and guns that could no longer be pulled by horses that were already lying on their sides in ditches. Marshal Ney led rear guards that fought with the resolve of men who have no other choice, and began to earn the title that French storytellers would later give him, the bravest of the brave. Disease had marched with the army from the first. It now took a larger share. Typhus and dysentery became as lethal as any Russian ambush. When the columns reached the Berezina River in late November, they found the bridges gone and Russian armies coming from two directions. The banks were boggy and the water cold and full of floating ice. French engineers who had kept their tools and their nerve under General Eble set about building bridges. They worked with a skill that still inspires awe. Men tore buildings down for timbers. Troops waded out to set piles, while musket balls slapped the water around them. For 2 days, the army poured across 2 spindly bridges, while Russian guns tried to find the range. Crowds jammed the approaches. Wagons toppled. A portion of the rear guard was cut off and perished. Yet the bridges held long enough for a remnant to cross and to burn the planks behind them. Beyond the Berezina, the survivors became a collection of ghosts. In the snows near Smorgoni, Napoleon told his marshals he would leave the army and race back to Paris. News had arrived of a plot in the capital that had briefly convinced soldiers that the emperor was dead and the regime already replaced. He wrapped his face in a cloak, took a sleigh, and fled west on a road policed by gendarmes with orders to clear the way. He left the army to Marshal Murat and then to Marshal Berthier. For those who had believed that his presence could make luck behave, the departure felt like the end of a spell. Of the 600,000 who had crossed into Russia in June, only a fraction recrossed in December. The exact figure will always dance because many marched away from the colors and tried to find food by themselves, and many died without a record. It is enough to say that an army had been broken into pieces so small that even victory in a later battle could not have put them back together. The loss carried a message that other powers could read. In 1813, Prussian officers who had been forced to serve as allies found courage to change sides. Austrian statesmen who had feared the man from Corsica calculated again and found that his numbers no longer frightened them. At Leipzig, in the autumn of that year, Napoleon fought the largest battle Europe had yet seen and lost. The next spring he abdicated and went to an island that seems tiny on any map where the Niemen and the Dnieper appear. He would return once more to test fortune, and then go to another island farther away. To say that the invasion of Russia was a mistake simplifies a tapestry of pride, policy, and misread geography. Yet the heart of the error is plain enough. Napoleon thought that a quick march and a single climactic battle would force the Tsar to the table. He misjudged the willingness of a monarch to trade land for time and then to trade a capital for a country. He believed that his army could feed itself in a land where the other side was willing to burn its own barns. He gambled that the moral effect of taking Moscow would work on Alexander as it had worked on so many others. He believed that he could control distance with orders. In Russia, distance answered with silence and cold. The emperor had mastered Europe by making time his ally. In that campaign time defected. The story is not a sermon about winter alone. The worst losses came from hunger and fatigue and disease long before the great frosts. The snow finished what bad arithmetic had begun. The lesson that soldiers carried away was not simply to bring warm coats. It was to bring humility when a map tempts a leader to trust long lines and smooth roads. The season changed, and with it changed a continent's confidence in a man who had once moved borders with a pen and a glance.